Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Rebecca Thorne had spent 11 years with the National Park Service, and in that time she'd developed an almost pathological need for explanations. Every broken branch had a wind pattern behind it. Every missing hiker had a logical cascade of poor decisions. Every strange sound in the forest could be traced back to elk, to settling trees, to the specific acoustics of narrow valleys. She'd written 3 peer-reviewed papers on predator-prey dynamics in the North Cascades, and her colleagues at the Marble Mount Ranger Station called her the Professor, with a mixture of affection and exasperation. On October 14, 2009, at approximately 2:47 p.m., Rebecca stood at mile marker 4.3 of the Cascade Pass Trail, elevation 4,800 feet, holding a Canon PowerShot camera that didn't make sense. The camera belonged to Ethan Morris, 19 years old, sophomore at Western Washington University, reported missing 48 hours earlier by his roommate. The roommate had shown up at the ranger station with printed emails about Ethan's independent research project on abandoned settlements in the North Cascades. The kind of project that sounded academic until you read between the lines and saw a kid chasing ghosts. Rebecca had found the camera wedged between 2 stones near a runoff stream, the kind of placement that wasn't natural, but wasn't obviously staged either. The LCD screen was cracked but functional. She'd bagged it properly, photographed its location with her department-issue Nikon, recorded GPS coordinates on her Garmin eTrex, and then, against protocol, scrolled through the images. The first 37 photos were standard hiker fare. Ethan grinning at trailheads, mossy trees, a black-tailed deer, his boots next to a topographic map. Then the images changed. Photo 38 showed weathered timber protruding from underbrush, structural remnants. Photo 39 captured a collapsed stone chimney, the mortar crumbling, but the German craftsmanship still evident in the precise angles. Rebecca recognized the site immediately, the Adler mining camp, established 1882, abandoned 1889 after what the historical records vaguely termed difficulties. Photos 40 through 53 documented the camp systematically. Ethan had approached this like an archaeologist. He'd photographed foundation stones, measured timbers, captured what looked like territorial markers, stacked rocks in patterns that predated modern trail cairns. Rebecca felt that familiar analytical satisfaction warming her chest. The kid had been thorough. Then came photo 54. It showed teeth marks in birch bark, not deer brows or bear claw. Teeth. Human teeth from the dimensions. The marks formed patterns, dozens of them circling a tree trunk at chest height. The bark was fresh stripped, white wood exposed like bone. Photo 55 was worse. A root cellar entrance, partially collapsed, the wooden door hanging from one rusted hinge. Scratch marks covered the inside surface. Deep gouges, fingernail width, running vertically as if something had clawed upward from underground. The final image, number 56, showed only darkness with a single detail visible in the camera's flash. Fabric. Old fabric, rotting, with what might have been lace trim. And just at the edge of the frame, barely visible, what looked like teeth. Not a skull's teeth, these were in a jaw that still had skin. Rebecca's Motorola radio crackled. "Thorne, this is base. You're 20?" She pressed the transmit button, her thumb steady despite the sour taste flooding her mouth. Mile 4. 3, Cascade Pass Trail. Found Morris's camera. Any sign of Morris himself? Rebecca looked at the tree line where old-growth hemlock gave way to the kind of undergrowth that could hide anything. The afternoon sun was already dropping behind Johannesburg Mountain, throwing long shadows across the talus slopes. Temperature had fallen 6 degrees in the last hour. Her weather meter confirmed it. Early season snow was forecast for tonight. Unusual for mid-October, but not unprecedented at this elevation. Negative on Morris, but I'm near the Adler campsite. His photos show he was investigating the ruins. Static then. The what camp? Old German mining operation, 1880s. It's in the historical database. Rebecca had read the file 2 years ago during a slow winter when she'd cataloged every documented human settlement within the park boundaries. The Adler camp had interested her because of the abrupt abandonment. 23 miners had simply left. No gold strike elsewhere to explain it. No documentation of why. Just empty buildings left to rot. Jesus, Thorne, you and your homework. Okay, we're losing light. Mark the location and return to base. We'll send a full SAR team at first light. Copy. But Rebecca didn't move. She stared at the camera's final image, at those teeth in the darkness. Her mind cataloged possibilities. Dental remains from a historical burial disturbed by animals. An old root cellar used as a cache site by contemporary hikers. Ethan Morris staging photos for his project, creating mystery where none existed. None of those explanations worked. The flesh on that jaw was wrong. Too intact. Too present. Rebecca had a master's degree in wildlife biology from the University of Montana. She understood decomposition rates, scavenger patterns, the precise timeline of how organic matter returned to soil. Whatever was in that photo didn't follow the rules. She clicked off the camera, sealed it in an evidence bag, and started documenting the area with her own equipment. Standard protocol. She photographed the creek, the tree line, the coordinates. Then she did what she knew she shouldn't. She went looking for the root cellar. The Adler camp ruins sprawled across roughly 3 acres of what had once been cleared land. Nature had spent 120 years reclaiming it, but the bones of the settlement remained. Rebecca found 5 foundation outlines, 2 collapsed chimneys, and what might have been a sluice system now choked with alder saplings. The root cellar sat at the eastern edge, dug into a hillside for natural insulation. The entrance was exactly as Ethan's photo had shown it. The wooden door, hung on one massive hand-forged hinge, had fallen partially open. Scratch marks covered the interior surface in clusters, deep enough that Rebecca could fit her fingernail into the grooves. She pulled out her mag light, clicked it on, and immediately wished she hadn't. The root cellar extended 12 feet into the hillside. Stone walls, dirt floor, empty except for remnants of wooden shelving along one wall, and fabric. Lots of fabric. Rotting cloth in heaps like discarded clothing. Dark stains on everything. The smell hit her a moment later. Not the expected must of old cellars, but something organic and wrong. Like meat left in a warm car. Rebecca's training screamed at her to back out, call it in, wait for the SAR team and possibly the county medical examiner. But her analytical mind had already spotted the inconsistency. The fabric was too old to smell that fresh. Her light played across the heaps, catching on details. Victorian-era clothing, by the style. Wool and linen rotted to tatters. Women's dresses. Men's work shirts. All piled in the far corner like someone had tried to make a nest. She stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately, more than the 2 or 3 degrees that underground spaces typically offered. This was cold that moved. That had presence. Rebecca's exhaled breath fogged white in the beam of her flashlight. Something rustled in the fabric pile. Rebecca froze, her light steady on the movement. A rat, probably. The cellar would offer shelter, except rats didn't make clothing rustle like that, like something underneath was breathing. Ethan? Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Ethan Morris, if you're in here, identify yourself. The rustling stopped. Rebecca stood in the silence, counting her own heartbeats, waiting. 15 seconds. 30. The air in the cellar had texture now, thick and stale. Her light showed mold blooms on the stone walls, white and fuzzy. Natural, explainable. But the coldness wasn't natural. It pressed against her skin like a physical weight. She backed out slowly, keeping her light trained on the fabric pile until she cleared the threshold. The late afternoon sun felt impossibly warm on her face. Her radio crackled again. Thorne, status? Investigating the camp ruins. No sign of Morris. You need to start heading back. Weather's changing faster than predicted. Fronts moving in from the coast. Rebecca looked west and saw the clouds piling up over El Dorado Peak, dark and heavy. The wind had shifted, bringing that particular smell that preceded mountain snowfall. She checked her watch. 4:17 p.m. She had maybe 90 minutes of good light left, and the trail back to the parking area was 2.5 hours at a steady pace. Copy. Heading back now. She didn't move. Instead, she pulled out her own camera and photographed the root cellar entrance, the scratch marks, everything. Documentation was her shield against uncertainty. If she could record it, measure it, catalog it, then it existed within a framework of understanding. She took 17 photos, varying angles and exposures, her professional habits overriding the growing unease in her stomach. Then she saw the symbols. They were carved into the door frame, worn almost smooth by weather and time but still visible in the right light. Rebecca adjusted her angle and there they were. Marks that looked like letters but weren't quite. Germanic runes, maybe, or folk sigils. She'd seen similar markings in her research on historical mining camps, protective symbols that immigrant communities carried from the old country. She photographed them carefully, getting close-ups. Back at the station, she had books on historical settlement patterns. She could identify these marks, trace their meaning. That was the thing about history. It left evidence. It could be understood. As Rebecca finally turned to leave, she noticed something she'd missed before. The birch tree that Ethan had photographed, the one with the teeth marks, stood directly in line with the root cellar entrance, a straight sight line, maybe 40 feet, and there were more marked trees beyond it, she realized now. 3 of them leading deeper into the forest, each one stripped in the same pattern, a trail or a boundary. Rebecca's analytical mind filed this away as she started back toward the main trail. Historical markers delineating property lines, bears using trees as territorial posts. Multiple explanations existed. The afternoon shadows grew longer, and with them came sounds, branches settling, wind through needles, the distant rush of snowmelt streams. All explainable, all normal. But Rebecca couldn't shake the image of those teeth marks. The human teeth, biting bark, over and over again. And as she hiked, she found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. She was afraid. The snow started at 6:42 p.m., just as Rebecca reached the trailhead parking lot. Her pickup truck sat alone in the gravel lot, covered in a thin layer of pine needles. She'd been in the woods for 8 hours. Her legs burned from the descent, and her water bottle was empty. Normal physical symptoms. Measurable fatigue. She sat in the truck cab with the heater blasting, reviewing her photos on the camera's LCD screen while she waited for the engine to warm up. The symbols on the doorframe showed up clear in the close-ups. She pulled out her field notebook and sketched them carefully, adding notes about their location and orientation. Her phone showed no signal, expected at this elevation, but she had a granola bar in the glove compartment and emergency supplies in the bed. Protocol was simple. Drive back to Marble Mount, file her report, hand over the evidence, and let the SAR coordinator decide next steps. Ethan Morris was still missing, but she'd documented his last known location and found potential evidence. She'd done her job. The road back followed the Cascade River, a winding descent through old-growth forest. Normally, Rebecca loved this drive, the way headlights caught the massive trunks of Douglas firs, the glimpses of white water through the trees. Tonight, she watched her odometer and counted switchbacks, anchoring herself in measurable distance. At mile marker 7, something moved across the road. Rebecca hit the brakes, tires skidding slightly on fresh snow. Her headlights caught a figure at the road's edge. Humanoid, but wrong. Too tall, too thin. Moving in a way that suggested joints didn't bend quite right. Then it was gone, vanished into the tree line so quickly Rebecca questioned whether she'd seen anything at all. A deer standing on hind legs, an elk, the shadows playing tricks after a long day of stress and adrenaline. She sat with her foot on the brake, engine idling, staring at the spot where the figure had been. No tracks in the snow. The beams of her headlights showed only the road, the trees, the normal structure of the forest at night. Rebecca forced herself to breathe steadily. counting inhalations. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. A technique she'd learned during her first years as a ranger, when night calls to remote areas had sometimes triggered panic responses. The body could be trained. Fear was just chemistry. She drove on, checking her rearview mirror too frequently. The road was empty behind her. Empty ahead. Normal October snow, normal darkness, normal forest. By the time she reached the ranger station in Marble Mount at 8:15 p.m., she'd convinced herself that exhaustion and stress had created the illusion. The station was a small building at the intersection of Highway 20 and the Cascade River Road, typically staffed until 9 p.m. during the fall season. Craig Holloway, the evening shift ranger, looked up from his computer when Rebecca came through the door, bringing cold air and snow with her. "Jesus, Thorne, we were about to call search and rescue for you." "Long day." Rebecca set the evidence bags on the counter. "Morris's camera and my documentation photos. I found the site he was investigating, old mining camp ruins. Adler Camp, historical file reference 1882 HC North." Craig picked up the evidence bag containing Ethan's camera, squinting at it. He was 56, near retirement, the kind of ranger who'd chosen the job for the solitude rather than the science. "Find anything else? The kid himself?" "Negative, but he was definitely at the campsite. His photos show significant interest in a root cellar at the location." "You checked the cellar?" "Partially. Needs a full investigation team. There's..." Rebecca paused, uncertain how to phrase it. "There's historical clothing inside. Piles of it. Could be relevant to the missing person case, or could be unrelated historical artifacts." Craig raised an eyebrow. "Clothing like old-timey stuff?" "Victorian era, approximately. I took documentation photos." "Weird." Craig logged the evidence, filling out chain of custody forms. "Say our coordinator wants a full team up there at first light. You planning to guide?" Rebecca should have said no. She'd already put in 8 hours, and protocol called for rotating rangers on search operations to prevent fatigue-based mistakes. But she knew the location now. She'd documented it, and some part of her, the analytical part that craved explanations, needed to understand what she'd seen in that root cellar. "I'll guide," she said. She spent the next hour writing her report, carefully neutral language describing everything she'd observed. Location coordinates, photo documentation, Ethan Morris's last confirmed position based on camera evidence, potential shelter location for the missing person in the form of a historical root cellar, recommended actions for the SAR team. She didn't mention the teeth marks in the trees, didn't describe the scratch marks inside the cellar door, didn't note the symbols carved into the door frame. Those details went into her personal field notebook instead, things she needed to research before deciding their relevance. At 9:30 p.m., Craig locked up the station, and they both headed to their respective vehicles. The snow had intensified, already laying 2 inches on the ground. Rebecca's truck started reluctantly, the cold seeping through metal and glass. She had a 20-minute drive to her cabin outside Rockport, a place she'd rented specifically because of its isolation. No neighbors, just forest and the sound of the Skagit River a quarter-mile away. The cabin's porch light glowed yellow through the snow as Rebecca pulled into the gravel drive. She'd left it on that morning, the automatic timer set for sunset. Normal precaution. But tonight it felt like a beacon, the only human light in miles of darkness. Inside, she made coffee, strong, black, the routine comforting, and spread her field notebook and camera on the kitchen table. Her laptop was old, a 2006 Dell that took 3 minutes to boot up, but it had all her research files. She'd scanned dozens of historical documents over the years, building a personal database of North Cascade settlement history. She found the Adler mining camp file in her 1880s folder. The documentation was sparse, a land claim filed in 1882 by Wilhelm Adler, a prospector from Bavaria. He'd brought 22 other German immigrants to work a small gold claim on what was now parkland. The operation lasted 7 years, producing modest yields. Then in October 1889, the camp was abandoned. No explanation in the official records. The land claim lapsed, and the property eventually became part of the National Park System in 1968. Rebecca clicked through her scanned documents, looking for anything that might explain the abrupt departure. She found a reference in a Bellingham newspaper from November 1889. The German miners of the Cascade River District have departed their claims, citing conditions unsuitable for continued operations. The exact nature of these conditions remains unclear, though some speculation exists regarding disagreements with local native populations. That was it. Vague. Unsatisfying. Rebecca hated unsatisfying answers. She opened a new search window and typed, "Protective Symbols Germanic Miners 1880s." The results were scattered: academic papers on folklore, museum exhibits, genealogy sites. She clicked through them methodically, comparing the symbols she'd sketched to historical examples. 30 minutes later, she found a match. A German folk magic compendium, digitized by the University of Heidelberg, showed symbols called Nachzehrer Ban, protective marks against a specific type of revenant. The entry was in German, and Rebecca's language skills were limited, but she used an online translator to parse the text. Nachzehrer. The word meant after devourer, a plague victim who didn't die properly, who chewed their burial shroud in the grave and thereby consumed their family members from beyond the grave. The text described them as creatures caught between life and death, feeding on the living through sympathetic magic. What they chewed in their coffin, their relatives felt as death from afar. Rebecca sat back from the laptop, coffee forgotten. This was folklore. Historical superstition brought from the old country by terrified immigrants who didn't understand disease vectors and natural death. It wasn't real, but she thought of the teeth marks on the birch trees. Human teeth, chewing bark. She thought of the fabric piles in the root cellar. Victorian clothing that smelled of fresh rot despite being 120 years old. She thought of the scratch marks on the inside of the cellar door, fingernails gouging wood as something tried to claw its way out. The academic text continued in translated clumsy English. The Nachzehrer must be stopped by ritual means, cutting the head and placing coins in the mouth, placing a stone under the chin, filling the grave with holy water, or cutting the tendons of the knees so the creature cannot rise. Once risen, it cannot be killed, but only returned to the earth through specific means. Iron implements, fire, the speaking of its true name while it feeds. Rebecca closed the laptop. This was insane. She was a biologist. She understood predator-prey relationships, decomposition rates, fungal networks, the measurable mechanics of the natural world. Folklore was interesting from a historical perspective, but it wasn't real. Except 23 German miners had abandoned a profitable claim in 1889 for unknown reasons. Except they'd carved protective symbols into their root cellar door. Except Ethan Morris had disappeared while investigating those same ruins, and his final photo showed something with teeth and flesh in a place that should have held only bones and dust. Rebecca's cabin felt smaller suddenly, the walls too thin. Outside, snow fell through the porch light, and beyond that circle of illumination stretched miles of wilderness. Forest that held 120 years of secrets. Trees that remembered what the miners had fled from. She checked the locks on both doors, something she rarely did. Made sure her cell phone was charging, though out here it wouldn't get signal until morning when she drove to higher ground. Her service weapon, a Glock 22 that she was certified to carry but rarely did, sat in its lockbox in the bedroom closet. She got it out, loaded it, set it on the nightstand. Rational mind, she was in a remote location, involved in a missing person case, taking reasonable precautions. But her hands shook slightly as she changed into sleep clothes, as she brushed her teeth, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling and listening to the old cabin settle around her. At 3:17 a.m., she woke to the sound of something moving on the porch. Rebecca held perfectly still, listening. The sound came again, footsteps, light and uneven, like someone walking with a limp, back and forth across the wooden boards. Then silence. She reached for the Glock, her heart hammering against her ribs. The bedroom window faced the porch, curtains drawn, but she could see the edge of the porch lights glow. A shadow moved through it. Tall, too tall, the proportions wrong. Rebecca forced herself out of bed, gun held properly in both hands, Every training protocol suddenly crystal clear in her mind. She moved to the window, staying to the side of the frame, and eased the curtain back an inch. The porch was empty. Snow fell steadily, undisturbed. The boards showed no footprints, no marks at all. She stood there for 5 minutes, watching, waiting for the shadow to return. Nothing moved, except snow. Finally, she lowered the gun and sat on the edge of her bed, adrenaline making her nauseated. Exhaustion, hallucination, stress response to a difficult day, the mind playing tricks. But when she finally slept again, she dreamed of teeth. Endless teeth, chewing through fabric, through wood, through flesh, and the sound of something scratching, deep underground, trying to get out. Morning came gray and cold. Rebecca woke at 6 a.m. to her alarm, feeling like she'd been beaten. Every muscle ached and her head throbbed with dehydration. She forced down water and instant oatmeal while reviewing her notes from the previous night. In the daylight, the folklore research seemed almost embarrassing. Ghost stories, superstition. But she packed the printouts anyway, folding them into her field notebook. The SAR briefing was scheduled for 7:30 a.m. at the ranger station. Rebecca arrived early and found a team already assembling. Craig Holloway, 2 younger rangers she knew by sight but not well, a K-9 unit from Snohomish County, and the county medical examiner's investigator, a tired-looking woman named Denise Carver, who carried a forensic kit. The SAR coordinator, Frank Messer, spread topographic maps across the conference table. He was former Army, efficient, and no nonsense. Thorne, walk us through what you found. Rebecca used a red marker to indicate locations on the map. Morris's camera here, mile marker 4.3. Adler Mining Camp ruins here, approximately quarter-mile northeast of the main trail. Root cellar at the eastern edge of the camp, dug into this hillside. Morris's photos show he was systematically documenting the site before he disappeared. What's the condition of the root cellar? Denise asked. Structurally unstable. Stone walls, dirt floor, partial roof collapse. Contains what appears to be historical clothing. Victorian era, significant quantities. Possible human remains, though I didn't conduct a full investigation. Everyone looked at her. Frank said, You saw remains? Possible remains. There's fabric and organic matter. I documented it photographically but didn't disturb the scene. Denise made notes. Okay, so we're treating this as a potential recovery operation as well as a search. How far can Morris have gotten if he left the cellar alive? Frank traced circles on the map. In 48 hours, if he's injured or disoriented, maybe a 2-mile radius. If he's sheltering, probably closer. Weather's been cold, but not deadly. We've got maybe 6 hours of good light today with this front moving through. The K-9 handler, a young man with a German shepherd named Rex, asked, Do we have a scent article? Morris's roommate provided a t-shirt, Frank said. Thorne, you'll guide the team to the site. Denise, you assess the root cellar. Everyone else fans out from there. Standard grid search. Radios on channel 3. Any questions? Rebecca wanted to ask if anyone else had researched the historical context. If anyone else had found the folklore. If anyone else was wondering why protective symbols had been carved into that door. But she stayed silent. Facts only. Observable evidence. They departed at 8 a.m., hiking in under clearing skies. The fresh snow made tracking easier. Any recent movement would show clearly. Rex strained at his lead, the shepherd's training overriding the distractions of the forest. The group moved efficiently, professionals doing familiar work. Rebecca led them to the camp ruins by 10:30 a.m. The site looked different in daylight, less ominous. Just old timber and stone, reclaimed by forest. The root cellar entrance gaped dark against the hillside. Denise approached it carefully, photographing the entrance from multiple angles before pulling on latex gloves and clicking on a high-powered flashlight. Rebecca and Frank stood behind her, watching as she swept the beam across the interior. Jesus, Denise said softly. The fabric piles were more extensive than Rebecca had realized. Dozens of garments, maybe 100, heaped in the far corner, and visible now in the stronger light. Bones. Human bones, scattered among the cloth. Skulls, ribs, long bones. all jumbled together, impossible to tell how many individuals. "This is a mass burial," Denise said, "or a mass dumping site. I need to call this in to the county sheriff. This is a crime scene, potentially historical, but we can't make that determination without—" She stopped. Her flashlight had found something on the far wall. Deep scratches, dozens of them, covering the stone surface. Fresh scratches, the stone powder still white where fingernails had gouged through lichen and dirt. "Those weren't there yesterday," Rebecca heard herself say. Frank turned to her. "You're sure?" "I documented this space. Those marks are new." The three of them stood at the cellar entrance, staring into the darkness. The cold air flowing out felt wrong, felt active, like breath. Rex started barking. The K9 handler struggled to control him as the shepherd lunged toward the tree line, hackles raised, teeth bared. "He's got something," the handler shouted. "Rex, heel! Rex!" The dog wouldn't stop. He strained toward the marked birch trees, the ones with the teeth impressions, toward the trail that led deeper into the woods. "Let him track," Frank ordered. "Everyone else, stay tight. Thorne, you're with me." They followed Rex into the forest, the shepherd pulling hard enough that his handler had to lean back. The marked trees formed a clear path, each one stripped in that same circular pattern. Teeth marks. Rebecca could see them clearly now, human dental impressions in white wood. Fresh sap wept from the wounds. They were new, made recently, made after Ethan Morris had photographed them. The trail led up slope, away from the camp ruins, into old-growth hemlock so dense the understory was clear. Rex moved faster now, baying. The sound echoed through the trees, wrong and alarming. Rebecca's radio crackled with check-ins from the other search team members, farther away now, their voices thin with distance. The trail ended at a shallow depression in the earth, ringed by stones. An old mining shaft partially filled in. The wooden frame had rotted away, but the hole remained, maybe 8 feet across. Rex barked at it continuously, refusing to approach closer than 10 feet. Frank pulled out his flashlight and shone it down. The beam disappeared into darkness. Could be 30 feet deep, could be 100. Morris could have fallen in. But Rebecca was looking at the stones ringing the shaft. They were carved with symbols, the same protective marks from the root cellar door, and hanging from a tree branch directly above the shaft. A piece of fabric. Red fleece. Modern, synthetic fiber. "That's from Morris's jacket," Frank said. "I saw the photo his roommate brought, red North Face fleece." Rebecca's analytical mind tried to construct a sequence. Ethan investigates the root cellar, disturbs something, flees into the forest, follows the marked trees, reaches the mining shaft, falls in, is pulled in, leaves his jacket behind as evidence or by accident. None of it made sense. The teeth marks on the trees were fresh. The scratches in the cellar were new. Something had been active here after Ethan disappeared. "We need rope," Frank was saying. "Technical rescue equipment. This could be a confined space recovery." He keyed his radio. "Base, this is Messer. We've located evidence of Morris at a secondary site. Old mining shaft. Need technical rescue." Static answered him. Then a voice, badly distorted. "Pete, shaft." "Base, you're breaking up. Repeat." More static. Then silence. Frank checked his radio, adjusting frequencies. Nothing. He looked at Rebecca. "You getting anything?" She tried her radio. Same static, same silence. "Equipment malfunction?" "We're not that far from the trailhead. Should have clear communication." Frank's jaw tightened. "Okay, new plan. You head back to the team, get rope and harnesses from the vehicles. I'll secure this site, make sure nothing else gets disturbed. You shouldn't stay here alone." "That's an order, Thorne." Rebecca wanted to argue, but protocol was protocol. She started back the way they'd come, following the marked trees in reverse. The forest seemed darker now, though the sun was directly overhead, that old-growth hemlock density creating permanent twilight. Her footsteps were too loud, her breathing too harsh. Behind her, Rex's barking cut off abruptly. Rebecca stopped, turned back. "Frank?" No response. The forest absorbed her voice like it had never existed. "Frank." Louder now, professionalism breaking. "Do you copy?" Static on her radio, then very faintly a voice that might have been Frank's. "Cellar, it's in the..." Then screaming, briefly, cut off. Rebecca ran. Training said don't run in the forest. Too easy to trip, to injure yourself, to become a victim needing rescue. But she ran anyway, pulling out her Glock as she crashed through undergrowth. The marked trees blurred past her. The mining shaft came into view. Empty. No Frank. No Rex. No K9 handler. The radio on the ground, Frank's radio, cracked and sparking, the red fleece fabric still hanging from the branch, and at the edge of the shaft, visible in the soft earth, drag marks. Something heavy pulled to the edge and over. Rebecca approached the shaft carefully, gun raised, flashlight in her other hand. She shone it down. 30 feet below, maybe more, she could see them. Frank, the handler, and Rex all piled at the bottom, not moving. The angle made it hard to tell if they were breathing. "Frank!" Her voice echoed down the shaft. "Frank, can you hear me?" One of the figures moved. Slowly. Wrong. Joints bending backward. Then it looked up, and Rebecca saw its face. It wasn't Frank anymore. The features were Frank's, the square jaw, the gray hair, the scar on his forehead from a hiking accident 3 years ago. But the expression was alien. The eyes were wrong, filmed over white like a corpse's eyes, and the mouth opened too wide, jaw dislocating, revealing teeth stained dark. It smiled at her. Rebecca stumbled backward, every rational thought in her mind dissolving. The thing that had been Frank started climbing, up the shaft walls, hands and feet finding purchase on stone that should have been smooth, moving with spider-like coordination. She ran. Branches tore at her face. Roots tried to catch her boots. Behind her, she heard it emerge from the shaft, heard it land on the forest floor with a wet, heavy sound, heard it start to follow. Rebecca's breath came in gasps. Her legs burned. The marked trees seemed to multiply, spiraling around her in patterns that made no sense. She'd lost the trail, lost direction. The forest pressed in, old growth giants blocking the sky. The root cellar appeared ahead, sudden and wrong. She was running in circles. The dark entrance gaped like a mouth. Behind her, the thing that wasn't Frank called out in Frank's voice. "Thorne, wait up. We need to secure the site." Rebecca dove into the root cellar. Inside, the darkness was absolute. Her flashlight had fallen somewhere during the run. She pressed herself against the stone wall, gun raised toward the entrance, trying to control her breathing. Frank's silhouette appeared in the doorway, backlit by forest light. It stood there, swaying slightly. "Thorne, you in there?" Frank's voice, but the rhythm wrong. Too slow. Words chewed. "Found something. You need to see." Rebecca's finger rested on the trigger. Every training protocol said identify your target. Don't shoot without certain threat. But the thing in the doorway wasn't Frank. Couldn't be Frank. It started to enter. Rebecca fired. The muzzle flash blinded her, the report deafening in the confined space. The thing staggered backward, hit center mass. Then it laughed. Frank's laugh, but damaged. Wet. It stepped forward again, and now Rebecca could see the wound in its chest. No blood, just darkness, hollow. She fired again. Again, emptying the magazine into it until the slide locked back. The thing absorbed each round, jerking slightly but never falling, never stopping. It reached for her with hands that were too long now, fingers extended. The nails were black and sharp. Teeth marks covered its forearms. It had been chewing itself, gnawing its own flesh. Rebecca screamed. Not a word, just pure animal terror. And then light flooded the cellar. Real light, bright and electric. A voice shouted, "Down, get down!" Rebecca dropped and something passed over her head. A sound like tearing fabric, like bone breaking. The thing that wasn't Frank made a noise, high and terrible, and collapsed. Hands grabbed Rebecca, pulled her out of the cellar. She fought them until she recognized Denise, the medical examiner's investigator. Behind Denise stood the two younger rangers, both holding something that looked like modified flare guns. "Get her to the vehicles," Denise ordered. "Now." Rebecca couldn't make her legs work. The younger rangers half carried her down the trail, moving fast. Behind them, Denise stayed at the cellar entrance, holding one of those strange devices. Rebecca heard her voice, chanting something in a language that sounded like German. They reached the parking lot. One of the rangers opened his truck and pushed Rebecca inside, started the engine. The other radioed for emergency response, but his voice was steady, like this was routine. Like whatever had just happened was something they understood. Rebecca found her voice. "Frank, the K9 team. They're in the mining shaft. They're gone," the ranger said flatly. His name tag read Mueller. "We know what this is. We know what it does." What was that thing?" Mueller exchanged a glance with the other ranger, whose name tag said Fisher. German names, Rebecca noticed distantly. Both of them young, maybe late 20s, both with expressions that said they'd seen this before. "Our grandparents worked the Adler camp," Fisher said. "They told us stories, warnings. We thought they were just old country superstitions until—" He stopped, shook his head. "We should have checked when Morris went missing. Should have known." "Known what?" Rebecca's voice was shrill. "What the fuck is happening?" Before either could answer, Denise emerged from the trail, moving quickly. She had something in her hands, a book, leather-bound and old. She climbed into the truck next to Rebecca. "Drive," she told Mueller. "Back to the station, don't stop." As they pulled out of the parking lot, Rebecca looked back. The forest line was dark, solid, but she could see movement in that darkness. Figures, multiple figures, tall and wrong, watching them leave. The truck's heater blasted, but Rebecca couldn't stop shaking. At the ranger station, Denise made coffee, real coffee, strong and bitter, and sat Rebecca down at the conference table. Mueller and Fisher stood by the door, still holding those modified flare guns. The devices looked homemade, cobbled together from hardware store parts and something that might have been religious icons. "You need to understand something," Denise began. "This isn't the first time. The Adler camp. The miners didn't leave because of disagreements or poor yields. They left because something came with them from Bavaria. In their belongings, in their memories. Maybe in their bodies." Rebecca's hands wrapped around the coffee mug, kneading the heat. "The folklore. Nachtzerer. You know about it. My grandmother was from the same region as Wilhelm Adler. She told me stories before she died. About the plague that hit their village in 1874. About the man who was buried but wouldn't stay buried. About what they had to do to stop him." Denise opened the leather book. The pages were handwritten German script. This was hers. Instructions, protections, how to recognize them, how to bind them. "They're not real," Rebecca heard herself say. "They can't be real." "They're real enough," Fisher said from the door. "My great-great-grandfather was one of the original Adler miners. He kept a journal, described what they found in the root cellar in 1889. One of their own, Heinrich Vogel, had died of pneumonia that winter. They buried him properly, Christian burial. But then people started getting sick, wasting away even though there was no disease, and they heard sounds from Heinrich's grave. Chewing sounds. They dug him up," Mueller continued. "Found him in the coffin, burial shroud half-eaten, his mouth working even though he was dead. They tried to burn the body, but it wouldn't catch. Tried to stake it, but the stake wouldn't go in. Finally, they sealed it in the root cellar with every protective symbol they knew. Then they left, abandoned everything and never came back." Rebecca's mind refused to process this. "That's impossible. Decomposition doesn't work that way. Bodies don't, Denise agreed. "But Heinrich Vogel isn't a body anymore. He's a Nachtzerer, and he's been in that cellar for 120 years, chewing, calling, waiting for someone to break the seals." "Ethan Morris," Rebecca said numbly. "He opened the cellar and became the first victim. The Nachtzerer takes them, feeds on them, makes them into extensions of itself. Frank Messer is gone, Rebecca. The K9 handler is gone. They're not coming back." Rebecca thought of Frank's face in the shaft, the white eyes, the too wide smile. What about other victims? The clothing in the cellar, all those bones. Hikers, Muller said. Occasionally, every few years someone wanders too close, gets curious about the old ruins. The symbols were failing, worn down by weather. We tried to maintain them, but we? Rebecca stared at them. You knew? All of you knew there was something dangerous there and you didn't tell anyone? Didn't warn? Who would believe us? Denise cut in. Who would believe that an 1880s German folk creature was killing people in a national park? We've been trying to manage it quietly, keep people away from that section of trail, maintain the protective symbols. But when Morris went missing, she closed her eyes. We should have acted faster. The room fell silent except for the coffee maker gurgling in the corner. Rebecca's entire worldview was cracking, reality rearranging itself into shapes that shouldn't exist. She was a scientist. She understood the natural world. But what she'd seen in that shaft, what had worn Frank's face, that wasn't natural. What do we do now? She asked quietly. Denise looked at the leather book. According to this, there's only one way to permanently stop a Knox error. You have to behead it, fill its mouth with consecrated coins, and burn the body at a crossroads. But to do that, you first have to find it in its resting place and speak its true name 3 times while it's feeding. Its true name? Heinrich Vogel. His living name, yes. But it has to be said at the right moment in the right place, by someone it's hunting. Denise looked at Rebecca directly. It's hunting you now. You entered its territory. You fired at one of its vessels. You're marked. The words landed like stones. Rebecca set down the coffee mug because her hands were shaking too badly to hold it. So what, I'm bait? You're the only one who can end this, Fisher said, if you're willing. Rebecca wanted to laugh, wanted to scream, wanted to run to her truck and drive until she hit an ocean. But she thought of Ethan Morris, 19 years old, who'd come to the North Cascades looking for history and found horror. She thought of Frank Messer, a good man and a good ranger, now a puppet for something that should have stayed dead. Tell me what I need to do, she said. They prepared through the afternoon. Denise had supplies in her vehicle, items that looked religious, protective. Iron nails, salt, a vial of water she claimed was holy, blessed by a Catholic priest in Bellingham who understood such things. The modified flare guns, which Fisher explained were loaded with iron filings and blessed silver. Iron disrupts them temporarily, Miller explained. Breaks the connection between the Knox error and its vessels, but it doesn't kill them. Only the proper ritual does that. They drove back to the trailhead at dusk, the sky going purple and orange over the mountains. 4 of them, Rebecca, Denise, Muller, Fisher, each armed with the makeshift weapons and symbols. Rebecca also carried her reloaded Glock, though she'd been told bullets were useless. It made her feel better anyway, the weight of it. The hike to the Adler camp ruins in darkness was surreal. Their flashlights carved tunnels through blackness, and every sound made Rebecca flinch. But the forest was quiet. Too quiet. No animals, no wind. Just their footsteps and breathing. The root cellar waited, darker than the surrounding night. Denise had painted fresh symbols on the doorframe using something from a small jar. Paint mixed with ash and blood, she'd said. Don't ask whose blood. The plan is simple, Denise said, voice low. Rebecca goes in first, alone. She needs to draw it out, get it feeding. When it comes, she speaks the name 3 times. We'll be waiting with the tools. Define feeding, Rebecca said. Denise didn't answer, which was answer enough. Rebecca clicked on her flashlight, checked her Glock one more time, and entered the root cellar. The darkness swallowed her immediately. Her flashlight beam seemed weaker than it should be, barely penetrating a few feet. The cold was worse than before, so intense her breath came out in clouds. The fabric piles loomed in the corner, higher now, growing. She stood in the center of the cellar, forcing herself to breathe steadily. Heinrich Vogel, she said clearly, I know what you are. Silence, then rustling from the fabric pile, something moving underneath. You were a miner. You died in 1889. Pneumonia. They buried you. But you didn't stay buried. More rustling. The pile shifted, fabric sliding away. Something rising. You've been here for 120 years, chewing, feeding, taking victims, using them. The thing that rose from the fabric was human-shaped but wrong. Too tall, limbs too long, spine curved in ways that suggested the bones had gone soft. It wore tatters of 19th century clothing, wool trousers, a rotting shirt. Its face was Heinrich Vogel's face, or had been once. Now the skin was parchment thin, stretched over a skull with too many teeth. And it was chewing. Its jaw worked constantly, grinding, the sound like nails on stone. "Rebecca Thorne," it said in a voice like dirt. "The scientist. You don't believe." "I believe now." It moved closer, and Rebecca saw that it was chewing something. Fabric, flesh, wood, all mixed together. Chewing and chewing, its mouth never stopping. This was how it fed, Denise had explained. Sympathetic magic. What it chewed in its grave space, its victims felt as death. "You cannot stop me," Heinrich Vogel said. "I am hunger. I am the grave that will not sleep. I am—" Rebecca fired. The bullet passed through its chest, through the hollow space where organs should be. It laughed. "Your science is useless here, scientist. I am older than your understanding, older than your reason." It reached for her, and Rebecca backpedaled, her training screaming at her to run. But running meant failure, meant more victims. She held her ground, flashlight and gun both trained on the thing. "Heinrich Vogel," she said clearly. "I name you. Heinrich Vogel." The thing paused, its jaw stopping mid-chew. Something like fear crossed its ruined face. "Heinrich Vogel," Rebecca said for the third time. The thing screamed, not a human sound, something deeper, older, full of rage and hunger and despair that had festered for 120 years. It lunged at her, and Rebecca dove aside, hitting the stone wall hard enough to crack her shoulder. Denise and the Rangers burst through the entrance, flare guns blazing. Iron and silver erupted in brilliant sparks, coating the thing. It convulsed, the connection to its vessels breaking. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the cellar, Rebecca heard distant screams. Frank, the K9 handler, however many others it had taken over the years, all released at once. Heinrich Vogel collapsed, the shell that had been its body cracking like pottery. Muller was already moving, a short-handled axe in his hands. He brought it down with brutal efficiency, separating the head from the body. Fischer forced open the jaw and placed 3 silver coins inside, 19th century German marks that Denise had somehow acquired. Then they were dragging the pieces outside, moving fast. There was a place where 2 trails crossed, a literal crossroads. They built a pyre there with wood they'd prepared earlier. The body went on top, and Denise poured accelerant from a gas can. "Everyone back," she ordered. The fire caught immediately, unnaturally fast. Flames shot 10 feet high, burning white and blue. The body blackened, curled, and something escaped from it. Vapor or smoke or spirit, visible for just a moment as a screaming face before the flames consumed it. They stood watching until the fire burned down to ash, until nothing remained but charred wood and the smell of burning. Rebecca's shoulder throbbed where she'd hit the wall, and her hands wouldn't stop shaking. But she was alive. "Is it over?" she asked. "It's over," Denise confirmed. "The Noxerer is destroyed. Its vessels will recover if they survive the separation." "And if they didn't?" Denise didn't answer. They hiked back to the vehicles in silence. Dawn was breaking by the time they reached the parking lot, the sky going pink and gold over the Cascades. Normal morning, normal light. The world continuing as if nothing had happened. 3 weeks later, Rebecca Thorne submitted her resignation to the National Park Service. She told the district supervisor that she was pursuing other opportunities, which was technically true. She'd been offered a position at a private research institute in Seattle, studying historical settlement patterns. Good pay, normal hours, no overnight stays in the wilderness. Frank Messer had been found at the bottom of the mining shaft with a broken leg and severe hypothermia. He survived but had no memory of anything after reaching the shaft. The K-9 handler had similar injuries, similar amnesia. Rex had to be put down. The separation from the devourer had done something to his mind, left him violent and uncontrollable. Ethan Morris's body was never found. The official report listed him as a missing person, presumed dead due to exposure. His parents held a memorial service in Bellingham. Rebecca attended, standing in the back, unable to tell them the truth. The Adler mining camp ruins were declared off-limits. The trails officially closed due to structural hazards. Muller and Fisher still worked as rangers, still maintained the protective symbols, still watched, just in case. Rebecca's cabin sold quickly. She'd priced it low, eager to leave. She moved to Seattle, to an apartment on the 8th floor of a building with 200 other residents. Lots of people, lots of noise, lots of electric lights that never went out. She didn't go hiking anymore, but sometimes at night, in the space between sleeping and waking, she heard it. The sound of chewing. Relentless. Patient. And she wondered if they'd really destroyed Heinrich Vogel, or if they'd only driven him deeper. Wondered if somewhere in the dark places of the North Cascades, in root cellars and mine shafts and forgotten graves, other things were waiting. Other things that were hungry. Other things that chewed. She kept Denise's leather book on her nightstand now, just in case she needed to remember. Just in case someone else went missing in the mountains and the rangers called her, and she had to explain about protective symbols and true names and things that should stay buried. But mostly, she tried not to think about it. Tried to lose herself in her research, in the safe abstraction of historical data and documented facts. Tried to be the scientist she'd always been. Sometimes it even worked. On December 3rd, 2009, Rebecca woke at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of something moving outside her apartment door. Light footsteps, uneven, like someone walking with a limp, back and forth across the hallway carpet. She lay perfectly still, listening, counting heartbeats. The footsteps stopped. A shadow passed across the gap beneath her door. Tall. Too tall. Then silence. In the morning, the hallway was empty. No footprints, no signs of disturbance. Building security showed nothing on the cameras, just Rebecca Thorne, former ranger, standing in her doorway at 3:20 a.m. looking at empty space. She called in sick to work that day, and the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the week, she'd purchased a one-way ticket to Portland, somewhere else, somewhere new. Somewhere that didn't have forests or mountains or shadows that moved wrong. But geography doesn't matter to hunger. Geography doesn't matter to things that chew their way up from underground, that feed on doubt and fear, and the terrible knowledge that the world is stranger and darker than science allows. Rebecca knows this now, knows it in a way that can't be unlearned. She knows that she spoke Heinrich Vogel's name 3 times, and in doing so, connected herself to him, to it, to the hunger that never dies. She knows that the devourer was destroyed, but its echo remains. In her, in the way she sometimes catches herself chewing nothing, jaw working unconsciously. In the way food tastes like ash now. In the way she's losing weight, wasting, even though she eats. She knows what's happening. And she knows, with terrible clarity, that somewhere in the dark something is chewing. Chewing her shroud, chewing her name, chewing her life. It's patient. It has time. It has eternity. And late at night, when the city noise fades and the darkness presses close, Rebecca Thorne finds herself chewing too. Not food, not gum, just air, just emptiness, just hunger. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Christopher Mercer had been a backcountry ranger for the National Park Service for 19 years. And in that time, he had developed a reputation for solving problems that confused everyone else. Missing hikers who turned up miles from their planned routes, equipment failures that seemed inexplicable, incidents that rangers attributed to bad luck or poor planning. Chris saw patterns where others saw chaos. He documented everything in his field notebook with the precision of a scientist. cross-referenced incident reports, mapped anomalies on topographic charts spread across his kitchen table. His colleagues at Olympic National Park headquarters called him the Professor, though never to his face. They meant it affectionately mostly. October 2007 brought the kind of weather that kept casual tourists away from the Hoh rainforest. The sky pressed down like wet concrete, and rain fell in vertical sheets that turned the already sodden earth into something that sucked at boot soles. Chris preferred it this way. Fewer people meant fewer rescues, and the forest revealed itself differently when human voices didn't carry through the moss-draped corridors of old growth. He stood in the ranger station at the Hoh Visitor Center, studying the topographic map pinned to the corkboard wall, trying to understand why Lauren Hayes had vanished. 26 years old, experienced hiker, good equipment. Last seen 4 days ago on the Hoh River Trail heading toward the High Divide. Her emergency contact, a sister in Portland, had called when Lauren missed their scheduled check-in. Chris ran his finger along the trail, calculating distances, considering the terrain. Lauren should have been back 2 days ago. The first search teams had found nothing. Maria Santos walked in carrying 2 thermoses of coffee, her park service jacket beaded with rain. She was 15 years younger than Chris, a relative newcomer who had transferred from Yellowstone the previous spring. Unlike the others, she seemed to appreciate his methodical approach, rather than find it tedious. "Search and Rescue wants to expand the grid," she said, setting 1 thermos on his desk. They're thinking she went off trail somewhere between Elk Lake and Salduke Park. Chris shook his head without looking up from the map. She wouldn't. Her gear list was comprehensive. She had a Garmin eTrex GPS, registered her route plan. Lauren Hayes was not the type to improvise. "People get disoriented," Maria offered, "especially in fog." "Not this one." Chris pulled Lauren's file from his desk drawer, flipped it open. Graduate student in forestry, published paper on old-growth forest ecology, 3 years of backcountry experience. She came here specifically to document western hemlock phenology along the High Divide Trail. He tapped the file. "This is someone who treats wilderness with respect and caution." Maria leaned against the desk, studying his face. "You're saying what?" "I'm saying the pattern is wrong." Chris reached for a different folder, one he had compiled himself over the past 18 months. Lauren Hayes is the 5th person to disappear in this specific area. May 2006, Richard Dalton, solo hiker. August 2006, Patricia Chen, trail runner. February 2007, Marcus Webb, experienced mountaineer. June 2007, Angela Reeves, nature photographer. All of them vanished within a 3-mile radius of the Salduke River tributary, between 1,200 and 2,000 feet elevation. Maria straightened. 5 people? Why haven't I heard about this? Because officially they're unrelated incidents spread across different seasons. Most were classified as presumed accidents, falls, exposure, animal attacks. Webb's case was closed as probable avalanche even though there was no avalanche activity that week. Only 1 body was ever recovered. Chris opened another file, and Maria flinched. The photographs showed what remained of Patricia Chen, or what they thought was Patricia Chen. The identification had been made through dental records. Found 13 months after she disappeared, 8 miles from where she was last seen. Medical examiner's report noted extensive predation damage, and closed it out. "Jesus," Maria whispered. Chris closed the file gently. "The official explanation is that we have a dangerous area with difficult terrain and unpredictable weather, but the data doesn't support that. This section of trail is actually less treacherous than a dozen other routes in the park. We haven't had a fatal incident here in the 8 years prior to 2006. Then suddenly, 5 people in 18 months. What do you think happened to them?" It was the question Chris had been avoiding, because the logical part of his mind, the part that made him good at his job, kept running into a wall. He had theories, of course, drug operations in the backcountry, though that seemed unlikely in terrain this remote. A predator, though no animal in the Pacific Northwest hunted humans with this kind of consistency. Someone deliberately targeting hikers, though the distances and timing made that nearly impossible. Each explanation had holes. "I don't know," he admitted. but I'm going to find out. I'm heading up the Hoh River Trail tomorrow at first light, following Lauren's exact route. I want to see what she saw. Maria nodded slowly. I'm coming with you. It's not necessary. 5 people, Chris. If you're right about a pattern, you shouldn't go alone. He wanted to argue, but she was correct. Protocol dictated a minimum of 2 rangers for backcountry investigation. Besides, something about the case unsettled him in ways he couldn't articulate, and he found himself grateful for the company. They left the following morning under a ceiling of cloud that reduced visibility to 50 yards. The Hoh River Trail wound through forest so ancient and dense that it seemed to exist outside normal time. Western red cedar and Sitka spruce rose like cathedral pillars, their trunks wider than truck beds, wrapped in blankets of moss that muffled sound. Everything dripped. Water filtered through the canopy in a constant mist, collected in the ferns and fallen logs, ran in rivulets across the trail. Chris had hiked this route hundreds of times, but today it felt different. The usual birdsong was absent. The forest was watching. How far in was Lauren when she made her last contact? Maria asked. Her voice seemed too loud. Chris checked his GPS unit, a yellow Garmin identical to the one Lauren had been carrying. According to her sister, Lauren sent a text message at 1:47 p.m. on the 3rd day. She said she was about to leave the main trail to document a grove of old-growth hemlock about a quarter-mile southwest of the 7.5-mile camp. That was her last communication. They hiked in silence after that, Chris counting paces and watching the forest floor for anything unusual. His notebook stayed in his hand, occasionally marking observations. At mile 7.3, he stopped. This is where she would have turned off. The forest here looked no different from any other section. The same massive trees, the same undergrowth of ferns and salal, the same carpet of moss and decay. But when Chris studied the ground more carefully, he found what he was looking for. Faint disturbances in the duff, barely visible impressions that might have been boot prints. They led southwest, directly away from the maintained trail. "You're sure?" Maria asked. Chris knelt, examining the impressions. Size 7 women's hiking boot. Probably Vasque or Morel based on the tread pattern. Lauren wore size 7. He stood, brushing wet moss from his knees. This is her trail. They followed the prints for 20 minutes, Chris photographing and marking their position every 50 yards. The terrain grew rougher, the undergrowth denser. The prints became harder to follow, then disappeared entirely where a recent rain had washed across a clearing. Chris stood in the center of the open space, turning slowly, trying to think like Lauren Hayes. If she had come here to document old-growth hemlock, where would she have gone? Maria touched his arm. "Chris, look at this." She was standing at the edge of the clearing, pointing at something on the trunk of a massive cedar. Chris walked over, his stomach tightening. Carved into the bark, about chest height, were symbols he didn't recognize. Not random graffiti or trail markers, but deliberate symbols that looked old, the edges of the cuts weathered and dark with sap. 5 symbols in a horizontal line, each about 4 inches across. The first resembled a stick figure with elongated limbs. The second looked like concentric circles. The third was an angular spiral. The fourth showed what might have been a skeletal hand. The fifth was the worst, a figure with antlers or branches growing from its head, arms raised, mouth open in what could have been a scream or a roar. "What the hell is that?" Maria whispered. Chris photographed the symbols from multiple angles, then pulled out his notebook and sketched them carefully. "I don't know. Could be old logging marks or... That's not a logging mark." She was right. These symbols had a ceremonial quality, a deliberate, artistic intention. Chris thought about the Quileute people who had lived in this region for thousands of years before the park was established. He had read about their legends, the stories they told about things in the forest. But these symbols didn't match anything he had seen in the cultural history texts. "We need to keep moving," he said, though his hands had started shaking in a way that annoyed him. "Lauren came this direction. We need to find out why." They continued southwest, the forest growing darker despite the early afternoon hour. The clouds had lowered further and fog now moved between the trees like a living thing. Chris noticed that the temperature had dropped, his breath beginning to show in small puffs. That was wrong. October in the Hoh rainforest rarely got cold enough for visible breath, especially during the day. Maria zipped her jacket higher. "Is it just me, or—" "It's colder," Chris confirmed. "At least 15 degrees colder than it should be." His scientific mind immediately began calculating explanations. Cold air drainage, though they hadn't descended significantly. A microclimate created by the local topography, though nothing about this valley seemed unusual. Temperature inversion, though that typically occurred at night. None of the explanations satisfied him. They found Lauren's backpack 30 yards further on. It lay against the base of a Sitka spruce, partially hidden by ferns. The pack was a Gregory Diva, still fully loaded, the waterproof cover intact. Chris approached it carefully, photographing it in place before touching anything. When he opened it, everything was there. Sleeping bag, tent, stove, food, first aid kit, even Lauren's wallet and cell phone. The phone was dead, the battery drained, but that meant nothing. Cell coverage was non-existent this far into the backcountry. She wouldn't abandon her pack, Maria said. Not with all her gear. Chris agreed. A hiker might drop a pack temporarily to explore or to move faster in an emergency. But Lauren's pack showed no signs of haste. It had been set down carefully, almost placed. He searched the surrounding area looking for any sign of struggle or disturbance. The forest floor was pristine. "Chris." Maria's voice had changed, gone tight. "Over here." She was 20 feet away, staring at a space between two ancient hemlocks. Chris walked over and the air seemed to thicken around him. On the ground, arranged in a perfect circle about 10 feet in diameter, were bones, animal bones. He could see the remains of deer, possibly elk, smaller creatures he couldn't immediately identify. The bones were old, cleaned by weather and scavengers, but they had been deliberately arranged. The circle was too precise to be natural. In the center of the circle stood a small cairn of stones, and on top of the cairn sat a human skull. Chris felt his analytical mind fracturing, trying to process what he was seeing. The skull was old, the bone yellowed and cracked but unmistakably human. His training told him to radio this in immediately, secure the scene, wait for proper authorities. But his hands moved of their own accord, pulling out his camera, documenting everything. "We need to leave," Maria said. "Right now. We need to document." "Chris." She grabbed his arm, her grip painful. "We need to leave right now." He looked at her face and saw something he had never seen there before. Raw terror. Her eyes were locked on something behind him. Chris turned slowly. At first, he couldn't process what he was seeing. The fog had thickened, and shapes moved within it that didn't make sense. Too tall, too thin, moving wrong. Then the shapes resolved into something his brain could categorize, and he wished they hadn't. There were figures in the fog, 3 of them, human-shaped but fundamentally wrong. They were impossibly tall, 7 or 8 feet, and so emaciated that their bones seemed to stretch their skin to translucence. Their limbs were too long, the joints bending at odd angles. But it was their faces that stopped Chris's breath. They had faces, human faces, but stretched and distorted, with mouths that opened too wide and eyes that reflected light like an animal's. The figures didn't move. They simply stood there in the fog watching. Chris's hand found Maria's arm and they backed away slowly, never taking their eyes off the shapes. His mind was screaming that this wasn't possible, that he was experiencing some kind of hallucination, oxygen deprivation, anything but what his eyes were showing him. One of the figures tilted its head, and Chris heard a sound that would replay in his nightmares for months afterward. It was a voice, but no human throat should have been able to produce it. A wet clicking sound that formed something like words. Hungry. So hungry. Always hungry. They ran. Chris had never run from anything in his life, had always prided himself on his calm rationality in crisis situations. But something primal had taken over, some ancestral part of his brain that recognized predator and screamed at him to flee. He crashed through the undergrowth, Maria beside him, branches whipping their faces. His GPS unit fell from his belt, and he didn't stop to retrieve it. Behind them he could hear movement, slow, deliberate, unhurried. The things weren't chasing them. They didn't need to. They reached the main trail and kept running, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Chris's lungs burned and his legs felt like water, but he pushed harder. He didn't know how long they ran. Time had become meaningless, but eventually Maria grabbed him and forced him to stop. They collapsed against a fallen log, gasping. "What?" Maria couldn't finish the sentence. Chris's hands shook violently as he pulled out his radio. Static. He adjusted the frequency, tried again. More static. The radio should have worked. They weren't that deep in the backcountry. He tried his cell phone. No signal, which was expected, but the phone's battery was at 11%. It had been fully charged that morning. "We need to get out of here," he managed. "We need to report this." But report what? He had just seen something that shouldn't exist, and the rational part of his mind was already trying to explain it away. Hallucination, hypothermia, some kind of atmospheric distortion. Except Maria had seen it too, and his camera had been running. The evidence was there. They hiked out in near silence, moving as fast as the terrain allowed. The forest seemed to close in around them, every shadow now potentially hiding something impossible. It took them 5 hours to reach the trailhead, hours that felt like days. The sun was setting when they reached Chris's truck, and he had never been so grateful to see asphalt and civilization. The drive back to headquarters was a blur. Chris's mind kept replaying what he had seen, trying to categorize it, explain it, make it fit into his understanding of the world. Humans who weren't human, figures that moved wrong, that voice, hungry and alien and wrong. Maria broke the silence when they were 10 minutes from town. What were they? Chris gripped the steering wheel harder. "I don't know. But you have an idea." He did, though it made no sense. After they had found Patricia Chen's body 13 months ago, Chris had researched local legends, trying to understand if folklore might provide context for the unusual circumstances of the disappearances. The Quileute people had stories about many things: shapeshifters, trickster spirits, beings that lived in the boundary between worlds. But one story had stuck with him, told by an elder he had interviewed at the tribal center. The old man had called them Quadi, which Chris had later learned was related to the Algonquian word Wendigo. Spirits of winter and famine and endless hunger, things that had once been human but had broken the most fundamental taboo. They had consumed human flesh, and in doing so had transformed into something else. Something always hungry, never satisfied, growing larger with each victim they consumed. The elder had said the spirits were drawn to isolation, to places where people were alone and vulnerable. He had said they were patient hunters who stalked their prey for days before taking them. He had also said they were active again. Chris had documented the interview in his notebook, filed it away as interesting cultural context. He hadn't believed it, of course. He was a man of science, of data and evidence. But now, driving through the darkness with his hands still shaking, he found himself reconsidering everything. At headquarters, they filed an incident report, though Chris carefully edited what they had seen. "Unknown large animals observed in the area," he wrote. "Possible grizzly or black bear activity." It was a lie, but the truth would sound insane. Maria didn't argue with his wording. They were both thinking the same thing. Who would believe them? Chris went home to his small apartment in Forks, downloaded the photographs and video from his camera, and spent the night staring at his laptop screen. The images of the carved symbols, the bone circle, the skull, and then, in several frames of video he had accidentally recorded while running, shapes in the fog. They were blurry, indistinct, but they were there. Tall, wrong. He opened his field notebook to a blank page and began writing, documenting everything exactly as it had happened. His scientific training demanded precision even when describing the impossible. At 3 a.m., he finally allowed himself to write the word he had been avoiding: Wendigo. The term came from Algonquian-speaking peoples, Cree, Ojibwe, Innu. The word itself meant evil spirit or cannibal spirit. The legends varied slightly between tribes, but the core elements remained consistent. A being of insatiable hunger, associated with winter and famine. A creature that had once been human, but had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Some versions said the transformation occurred when a person resorted to cannibalism. Others said the Wendigo spirit could possess the weak-willed, driving them to consume human flesh. All versions agreed on the result. Something that looked human but wasn't. Something that could never stop hunting, never stop feeding. Chris had always dismissed such stories as mythology, cautionary tales designed to prevent cannibalism during harsh winters. But what if the legends were based on something real? What if there were things in the deep wilderness that predated human understanding, that existed in the spaces where maps ended? He pulled up reports on the 5 disappearances, reading them with new eyes. Richard Dalton, the first victim, had been an avid outdoorsman. His last blog post mentioned feeling watched during his hike. Patricia Chen's recovery report noted that her body had been found partially consumed, though they had attributed it to animal scavenging. Marcus Webb, the mountaineer, had left a note at his last camp mentioning, "Someone following me, but when I stop, they stop too." Angela Reeves, the photographer, had uploaded several images to her cloud storage before vanishing. Chris pulled up the images now. Forest scenes, nothing unusual, until the last photo. It showed a stand of trees, and in the deep background, barely visible, was a tall figure. Chris enhanced the image as much as his software allowed. The figure was skeletal thin, too tall, its face a blur but its posture unmistakable. It was watching Angela take the photograph. He closed his laptop, his hands trembling again. Lauren Hayes had walked into that forest 4 days ago, and she was still out there, either dead or worse, and whatever had taken her was still hunting. The next morning, Chris requested a meeting with the park superintendent. He brought his documentation, his analysis, everything except the word Wendigo. He presented it as a serial predator scenario, possibly a disturbed individual living in the backcountry, using the forest to hunt vulnerable hikers. The superintendent listened, reviewed the materials, and agreed to authorize an expanded search operation with law enforcement involvement. But Chris knew no amount of search teams would stop what was out there. This required something else. He spent the afternoon in the park library digging through historical records. The Olympic Peninsula had been inhabited for thousands of years before European contact. The Quileute, Ho, and Quinault peoples had lived in these forests, and they had knowledge that went deeper than anything in Chris's textbooks. He found references to ceremonies, to taboos, to ways of protecting oneself from malevolent spirits. Fire was important, salt, certain plants, tobacco, sage, cedar, and most importantly, one should never travel alone. That evening, Chris drove to the Quileute Tribal Center in La Push. He found the elder he had interviewed months before, a man in his 80s named Joseph Blackcloud. The old man's face was deeply lined, his eyes sharp and knowing. "You saw them," Joseph said before Chris could speak. It wasn't a question. Chris sat down heavily. "Yesterday, in the forest near Solduc River tributary. I need to understand what they are." Joseph was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the gray ocean. Finally, he spoke in a low voice. "My grandfather told me about the Kuwaiti when I was young. He said they were once men, but they had done something so terrible that they became something else. They ate the flesh of other people during a winter when food was scarce, and the act changed them, made them into creatures of endless hunger. They can never be satisfied, you understand? Every person they consume makes them stronger, taller, colder, but it never fills the emptiness inside them. How do you stop them? You don't." Joseph looked at Chris with eyes that held depths of sorrow. "You can only avoid them. Stay away from the places they hunt. Never go into the deep forest alone, and never ever let yourself become isolated. But people are disappearing. A woman is missing right now. I have to. You can't save her." Joseph's voice was flat. "If the Kuwaiti have taken her, she is already gone, either consumed or becoming one of them. That is how they increase their numbers. They feed until their victims are nothing, or they possess the living and drive them to madness and cannibalism. Either way, The person you knew is lost. Chris felt rage building in his chest. There has to be something, some way to fight them. Joseph studied him for a long moment. There is one thing: fire. They are spirits of winter, of cold and hunger. Fire can harm them, drive them away. But you would need to bring the fire to them, and that means going into their territory. Are you willing to do that? Chris didn't hesitate. Yes. The old man sighed, then stood and walked to a shelf in the corner. He returned with a small leather pouch. This is tobacco, blessed in the old way, and cedar for protection. If you're going back into that forest, carry these with you. Burn them if you see the coyote. It may give you time to escape. Chris took the pouch, feeling its weight. Thank you. Don't thank me. I'm sending you to a place of death. Joseph gripped Chris's shoulder. Your mind wants explanations, wants to understand. But some things cannot be understood. They simply are. The coyote are hunger given form. They existed before humans came to this land, and they will exist after we're gone. All you can do is survive them. Chris left the tribal center as dusk fell, the pouch heavy in his pocket. He drove back to Forks, his mind churning. Everything in his training told him this was absurd, that he was giving credence to superstition instead of focusing on rational explanations. But he had seen those figures in the fog. He had heard that voice. And some deep part of him, older than his education and training, recognized the truth. At his apartment, he began preparing. Flares from his emergency kit, a lighter, batteries for his flashlight. He packed the blessed tobacco and cedar into a waterproof container. Then he sat at his kitchen table and wrote 2 letters. One to Maria, explaining where he was going and why. One to his sister in Seattle, in case he didn't come back. At 4 a.m., he left his apartment and drove to the trailhead. The forest was dark and still, the kind of darkness that felt deliberate. Chris shouldered his pack and started hiking, his headlamp cutting a narrow tunnel through the black. He knew this was reckless, knew he was violating every protocol and safety regulation. But 5 people were gone, and he couldn't shake the image of Lauren Hayes out there, alone, being hunted. The hike to Salduck River tributary took him 3 hours in the darkness. He moved carefully, watching for the landmarks he had memorized. When he reached the spot where they had found Lauren's pack, he stopped and listened. The forest was utterly silent. No birds, no small animals, nothing but the sound of water dripping from leaves and his own breathing. Chris pulled out the leather pouch and scattered some of the tobacco and cedar on the ground, then lit it with his lighter. The smoke rose in a thin column, and he whispered the words Joseph had taught him, words in a language he didn't understand. Protection, clarity, courage. Then he continued deeper into the forest. The temperature dropped with each step, his breath fogging in the air. Chris could feel the wrongness pressing in around him, the sense that he was being watched from every direction. The fog thickened, reducing visibility to a few yards. His headlamp seemed to dim, the batteries draining faster than they should. He found the bone circle again, the skull still perched on its cairn. But now there were fresh additions to the circle. Bones that looked newer, flesh still clinging to them. And in the center, next to the cairn, was Lauren Hayes's boot. Chris's stomach lurched. He photographed the scene with shaking hands, his professional training fighting against the rising panic. Then he heard movement in the fog behind him. He spun, pulling out his flashlight and flare gun. The beam of light caught something pale moving between the trees. Then another shape, and another. 3 of them, the same figures from before, circling him slowly. They were making sounds now, wet clicking noises that might have been communication or might have been hunger. I know what you are, Chris said, his voice steadier than he felt. His hand found the lighter in his pocket. Coyote, Wendigo, spirits of hunger. The figures stopped moving. The one directly in front of him tilted its head, and Chris saw its face clearly for the first time. It had been human once. He could see the remnants of features, a nose, cheekbones, eyes. But the humanity was stretched thin over something else. something that had grown too large for the skin it wore. The mouth opened, revealing too many teeth, too sharp. "Hungry," it said in that terrible wet voice. "Always hungry. Join us. Feed with us. End the hunger." Chris raised the flare gun and fired. The flare burst between him and the creature, burning brilliant red and white. The Wendigo screamed, a sound like wind through dead trees, and staggered back. The others retreated into the fog, hissing and clicking. Chris ran, not back toward the trail, but deeper into the forest, following some instinct he didn't understand. The creatures pursued him, moving through the trees with impossible speed despite their size. He could hear them behind him, around him, their voices calling out. Feed. Join. Hunger. Never end. Never satisfied. His chest burned and his legs felt like they would collapse, but Chris pushed harder. He burst into a clearing and stopped so suddenly he nearly fell. In the center of the clearing was a structure, an old cabin barely standing, half consumed by forest growth. Its door hung open. Chris had no choice. He ran inside and slammed the door, bracing it with a fallen beam. The cabin was small and dark, smelling of decay and something worse. His flashlight beam revealed old furniture, rotted and collapsed. And in the corner, curled into a ball, was a figure. "Lauren?" Chris's voice cracked. The figure moved, turning toward him, and Chris's hope died. It was Lauren Hayes, or had been. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken and wrong. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and when she opened her mouth, he saw that her teeth had changed, grown sharper. "So hungry," she whispered. "They showed me how to end the hunger. But it never ends. It never ends." Outside, the Wendigo were gathering. Chris could hear them circling the cabin, their voices rising and falling in that terrible clicking speech. The walls shook as something massive struck them. Wood splintered. Chris pulled out the leather pouch, scattered the remaining tobacco and cedar on the floor, and set it ablaze. The smoke filled the small space, and Lauren screamed, pressing herself into the corner. The sounds outside intensified, becoming frantic. "I'm sorry," Chris said, looking at what Lauren had become. "I'm so sorry." She looked at him with eyes that held a spark of the person she had been. "Kill me," she whispered. "Please. Before I'm completely gone. Before the hunger takes everything." The door exploded inward, and the Wendigo poured into the cabin. Chris fired his remaining flares, the burning light filling the space. The creatures recoiled, screaming, but there were too many of them. Chris felt hands, impossibly cold hands, grab him, pull him toward a mouth full of teeth. He had one flare left. He lit it and held it like a torch, swinging it at the nearest Wendigo. The creature's skin caught fire, burning with an intense blue flame. It shrieked and fled, crashing through the cabin wall. The others hesitated, their hunger warring with their fear of fire. In that moment of hesitation, Chris grabbed Lauren's hand and ran. They burst out of the cabin into the clearing, surrounded by fog and creatures. Chris swung the flare in wide arcs, keeping the Wendigo at bay. But the flare was burning down, would be gone in seconds. "Go!" Lauren screamed. She yanked her hand from his grip and ran directly at the nearest Wendigo, throwing herself at it. The creature caught her, its mouth opening wide. "Go!" Chris ran. He ran through the forest in the darkness, branches tearing his face and clothes, his lungs screaming for air. Behind him, he heard Lauren's final scream cut off abruptly, and the wet sounds of feeding. He ran until he couldn't run anymore, until he collapsed on the trail and lay there gasping. When the sun finally rose, Chris was still lying on the trail, shaking uncontrollably. His radio suddenly crackled to life. Somehow the interference was gone. Maria's voice came through, frantic, saying his name over and over. He managed to key the radio and whisper that he was on the trail, that he needed help. The rescue team found him 2 hours later, suffering from hypothermia and shock. They took him to the hospital in Forks, where he spent 3 days under observation. He told them he had gotten lost, become disoriented in the fog, spent the night in the forest, They accepted the explanation because it was easier than asking uncomfortable questions about why an experienced ranger would venture into the backcountry alone in the middle of the night. Lauren Hayes was officially listed as missing, presumed dead. Her body was never recovered. Chris returned to work after a week, but something had changed. He couldn't look at the forest the same way anymore. Every shadow seemed to hide something terrible. Every gust of wind carried voices that clicked and whispered about hunger. He requested a transfer, and 3 months later he was working at Mount Rainier National Park, as far from the Olympic Peninsula as he could get while staying in Washington. But the dreams never stopped. Dreams of Lauren's face as she made her final sacrifice. Dreams of tall figures moving through fog. Dreams of a hunger that could never be satisfied, growing stronger with each victim it consumed. And sometimes, on the coldest winter nights, Chris would wake in his apartment and feel certain that something was watching him from the darkness outside his window. Something tall and thin and patient. Something that remembered him. Something that was still hungry. He kept the leather pouch Joseph had given him on his nightstand. The blessed tobacco and cedar long since burned, but the pouch itself, a talisman. Next to it was his field notebook, filled with documentation of things that shouldn't exist. He had written it all down with scientific precision. The symbols, the bone circles, the creatures. Evidence of something that defied evidence. One entry in particular haunted him. He had written it the night before returning to work, trying to make sense of what had happened. The Algonquian peoples called them Wendigo. Other tribes had other names: Coati, Witico, Wendigo. The details varied, but the core remained the same. Spirits of endless hunger, former humans transformed by the act of cannibalism. The legends said they grew taller as they fed, that they brought cold with them, that they could possess the weak-willed and drive them to madness. I always thought these were just stories, warnings against survival cannibalism during harsh winters. I was wrong. The Wendigo are real. They hunt in the deep places, the spaces between our mapped world and the wild places that remember older rules. They are patient and intelligent, and utterly without mercy. They cannot be reasoned with or understood, only survived. And once you have seen them, truly seen them, you are changed. Part of you remains in their territory forever, marked by their hunger. Lauren Hayes died to save my life. She was transforming into one of them. I saw it happening, saw the humanity draining away as the hunger took over. But she held on to herself just long enough to make a choice. That kind of courage in the face of such horror. I will carry it with me always. There are other Wendigo out there, other hunting grounds. The 5 deaths in Olympic were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern. These things have always been in the wilderness, taking people who wander too far alone, who venture into the deep places without protection or knowledge. We dismiss the disappearances as accidents, as bad luck, as the dangers of wilderness recreation. We never see the pattern because we don't want to, but I see it now, and I know I can't stop what's coming. The Wendigo will continue to hunt. More people will disappear, and all I can do is document it, warn those who will listen, and try to survive with the knowledge of what lurks in the places where the map ends. 3 years after the events in Olympic, Chris received a package at his apartment. No return address, just his name in neat handwriting. Inside was a photograph of the Hoh rainforest, taken recently based on the digital timestamp. The image showed the trail he had hiked, the place where he had found Lauren's pack. Standing in the background, barely visible between the trees, were 3 tall figures, and in the foreground, scratched into the bark of a tree, were the same symbols he had found that October day. But there was a new symbol added to the end of the sequence, a simplified human figure with a circle around its head, a target, a mark. Chris burned the photograph in his sink that night, watching the flames consume the image. But he couldn't burn the message it carried. The Wendigo remembered him. They knew where he was, and sooner or later, when the winter came cold and hungry enough, they would come for him. He thinks about Lauren Hayes often, about the spark of humanity in her eyes in those final moments, about the choice she made. He wonders if he would have that same courage when his time came, or if the hunger would take him first, transform him into something that wore his face, but wasn't him anymore. The forest rangers at Mount Rainier think Chris is paranoid. They notice how he never hikes alone anymore, how he won't venture into the backcountry after dark, how he carries unusual items in his pack: tobacco, salt, dried sage. They whisper about him the way his colleagues in Olympic used to, calling him odd, obsessive. They don't understand that some knowledge changes you, that once you've seen the things between the trees, you can never go back to comfortable ignorance. On the coldest nights, when the wind howls down from the mountain and the temperature drops below zero, Chris sits at his kitchen table and writes in his notebook. He documents every report of missing hikers, every unexplained disappearance in the wilderness areas of the Pacific Northwest. The pattern is there if you know how to look for it. Isolated hikers, remote locations, cold weather, and always, in the weeks before the disappearance, reports of people feeling watched, of seeing tall figures in the distance, of hearing voices that click and whisper about hunger. The Wendigo are hunting. They have always been hunting. And Chris knows that all his documentation, all his warnings won't stop them. The forest keeps its secrets, and humanity keeps wandering into the deep places, alone and unprepared. He keeps the radio on his nightstand tuned to the National Park Service emergency frequency, waiting for the next call, the next missing hiker, the next person who ventured too far into the wilderness and met something that should only exist in legend. And in his dreams, he still hears Lauren's final words, "Go." Still feels her hand slipping from his, still sees the hunger in the eyes of the creatures that took her. The dreams are so vivid that sometimes he wakes unsure if he's really in his apartment or still in that clearing, surrounded by tall shapes in the fog, waiting for his turn to feed or be fed upon. Christopher Mercer had spent 19 years as a backcountry ranger, solving problems through logic and reason and careful analysis. He had believed in a world that could be understood, mapped, documented. That world no longer existed for him. Now he lived in a reality where the spaces between the trees held ancient hunger, where legends walked on two tall legs, where the wilderness was not empty but watching, waiting, hungry, always so hungry. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Nathan Cross had been documenting fungal growth patterns along the Hoh River Trail for 3 weeks when the call came through his Motorola radio. The static-laced voice of dispatch cut through the cathedral silence of the rainforest at 14:37 on October 28, 2009, requesting his immediate assistance with a missing person case. Emily Russo, 26, solo hiker, last known position approximately 4 miles northeast of his current coordinates. Nathan marked his GPS waypoint, latitude 47, 8156, longitude 123.8642, elevation 578 feet, and closed his field notebook with the methodical precision that had defined his 7 years with the National Park Service. The Hoh rainforest absorbed sound like a living thing. Sitka spruce and western hemlock rose 200 feet overhead, their trunks wrapped in club moss that dripped perpetually in the mist. Nathan had always appreciated the empirical beauty of this ecosystem. 140 to 170 inches of annual rainfall, a biomass density unmatched in North America, over 1,000 species of fungi creating a decomposition cycle that could reduce a fallen tree to soil in a human lifetime. The numbers comforted him. Data was reliable. Data didn't lie. He reached the trailhead parking area 43 minutes later and found Ranger Jessica Park reviewing a topographic map spread across the hood of her patrol vehicle. She looked up as Nathan approached, her expression carrying the controlled tension of someone managing a crisis by the book. Emily Russo, Sacramento resident, registered for a 3-day backcountry permit on October 26th, Jessica said, pointing to a highlighted route on the map. Planned circuit, Hoh River Trail to Elk Lake, then looping back via the old homestead area. She was due back yesterday afternoon. Her car's still here. No sign of her. Nathan studied the map. The homestead area. He'd hiked past it twice in his tenure here, both times noting the unusual atmosphere rangers developed around that sector. Nobody forbade access to the abandoned settlement, but nobody recommended it either. The unspoken understanding that some places deserved their isolation. "Last contact?" Nathan asked. Jessica produced a small digital recorder. "Radio transmission yesterday morning at 08:14. Brief, mostly static." She pressed play. The recording crackled with interference, Emily Russo's voice compressed and distant. "Following the creek bed as marked. Think I found something. Old structures near coordinates." A pause, longer than natural. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted fractionally toward uncertainty. "There's someone in the old cemetery. I can see." Static consumed the rest. Nathan replayed it 3 times, noting the timestamp, the background noise signature, the specific word choices. She said, "There's someone," present tense. Not, "there was someone" or "I saw someone." Active observation. "Search and rescue is assembling," Jessica said. "They want us to begin preliminary reconnaissance. You know the homestead area better than most." This was technically accurate. Nathan had surveyed the sector twice, documenting the architectural remnants of the 1880s German immigrant community that had attempted to establish a logging operation in the area. The venture had lasted less than 2 years before the settlers abandoned it. Park records attributed the failure to economic factors and the difficulty of the terrain. But Nathan's research had uncovered something more specific. A series of deaths in late 1881, cause listed simply as fever, 7 people in 3 weeks. The survivors had left abruptly, taking almost nothing. They reached the homestead site at 1652, the forest canopy so dense that premature dusk had already begun its descent. The settlement consisted of 4 collapsed structures and a small fenced cemetery, all slowly being consumed by moss and sword ferns. Nathan had photographed these buildings extensively during his previous visits, establishing a visual timeline of their decomposition. Science could measure everything, even decay. The cemetery occupied a small clearing where someone had once attempted to impose order on the chaos of the rainforest. 12 wooden markers, most illegible, enclosed by a fence of weathered posts connected with rust-eaten wire. Nathan approached with his digital camera ready, documenting as he advanced. Jessica split off to examine the nearest collapsed cabin. He noticed the disturbance immediately. The earth around one grave had been disturbed, fresh soil mixed with older sediment. Not recent enough to be from today, but within the past week. Someone had been digging. Nathan photographed the site from multiple angles, noting the specific location. 3rd row, eastern side, marker rotted beyond legibility. He knelt to examine the soil composition more closely. The smell reached him then. Not the clean decay of the forest, not the mushroom earth scent of decomposition following natural cycles. This was different, sweeter, wronger, like meat left in a closed space, but with an underlying sharpness that made his sinuses ache. "Nathan." Jessica's voice carried a careful neutrality that made him look up immediately. She stood near the largest collapsed cabin, holding something in her gloved hand. "Found Emily's GPS unit." He crossed to her position, already pulling evidence bags from his pack. The Garmin E-Trex was intact, screen still functional when Jessica pressed the power button. Nathan documented its location with his camera before they examined the stored waypoints. Emily had marked 17 locations over her 3 days in the backcountry. The last one, time-stamped 0809 the previous morning, was labeled simply, "Mistake." The coordinates placed it 200 yards northwest of their current position, deeper into the homestead ruins. Nathan felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he immediately categorized as heightened sympathetic nervous system response. Elevated heart rate, increased alertness, the body preparing for threat assessment, perfectly normal physiological reaction. They found Emily's campsite at 1723. The tent remained properly staked, no signs of distress or hurried departure. Her backpack lay inside, contents organized with evident care, food properly stored in a bear canister, water purification tablets, first aid kit. Her sleeping bag had been used but not packed away. A paperback novel rested on top, bookmarked 3/4 through. Her journal lay beside it. Nathan photographed everything before touching anything. Jessica called in their findings while he examined the journal, carefully turning pages with gloved hands. Emily's entries were brief, observational. She noted wildlife sightings, trail conditions, weather patterns. Nothing unusual until the final entry, dated October 27th. Found the old settlement. So much sadder than I expected. 12 graves, most are children. There's something carved on several of the markers, same symbol repeated. Looks like a curved line with smaller lines branching off. Almost like ribs, or maybe teeth. Going to photograph it tomorrow in better light. The ranger at the station said nobody knows much about who these people were. Seems wrong that they're just forgotten out here. Below this, in different ink suggesting a later edition, heard something walking around the tent last night. Heavy footsteps but wrong rhythm, like someone with a bad limp, probably an elk. That was the final entry. Nathan checked the timestamp on his camera against his GPS unit. They had approximately 43 minutes of usable light remaining. We're establishing this as base camp, Jessica said, ending her radio call. Sayar arrives at first light. We need to canvass the immediate area before dark. They split the search grid into quadrants. Nathan took the northwestern section, moving deeper into the homestead ruins. He found the symbol Emily had described on the 4th grave marker he examined, a curved line with 7 smaller lines descending from it, carved deep into weathered wood. He photographed it, made a pencil rubbing, and noted its location. The same symbol appeared on 5 more markers in the immediate vicinity. He was photographing the 7th instance when he noticed the structure, partially collapsed into itself, hidden behind a massive fallen spruce, stood what appeared to have been a root cellar. Stone foundation, wooden door hanging askew on leather hinges that had somehow survived 128 years of rainforest moisture. The door stood open approximately 18 inches, just wide enough. Nathan documented the structure's location, architecture, and state of preservation. He should wait for Jessica. Protocol suggested waiting for his partner, but the light was failing rapidly, and the methodical part of his mind that governed his decisions insisted that a preliminary examination would be more efficient. He approached the cellar entrance and aimed his flashlight through the gap. The beam illuminated stone steps descending into darkness. The walls were hand-cut stone, fitted without mortar in a technique uncommon in American frontier construction, but typical of European methods. German settlers would have possessed this knowledge. The temperature differential between the cellar and the outside air created a steady exhalation of cool dampness through the opening, carrying that wrong smell again, stronger now. Nathan descended 3 steps before his light found the shrine. Someone had arranged objects on a natural stone shelf approximately 6 feet down. Candles burned to irregular stubs, photographs too water damaged to identify, scraps of fabric, and at the center a book. Leather-bound, swollen with moisture. Nathan's hand moved automatically to document with his camera, but something made him pause. The objects had been placed recently. Some of the candle wax remained soft. He was reaching for the book when Jessica's voice called his name from somewhere above, tight with urgency. Nathan climbed back up, emerging into the twilight to find her running toward him through the trees. "We found her," Jessica said. "Or part of her trail. Fresh tracks heading east, but Nathan..." She stopped, catching her breath. "The tracks are wrong. The gait pattern doesn't match normal human locomotion. The stride is too long, and there's this dragging mark between the footprints like..." "Show me," Nathan interrupted. They documented the tracks thoroughly, Nathan photographing while Jessica measured. The prints were indeed wrong. Too deep at the toe, too shallow at the heel. The spacing suggested a stride of nearly 4 feet, impossible to maintain naturally through this terrain. And between each pair of prints, something had scraped through the moss, leaving a furrow approximately 2 inches wide. They followed the trail for 70 yards before full darkness forced them to halt. The tracks led steadily east, toward a section of the forest where the tree density increased and the canopy became absolute. Nathan marked the final GPS waypoint, and they returned to establish night camp near Emily's tent. Jessica assembled their emergency shelter while Nathan organized their supplies with meticulous care. Order imposed control. Control mitigated chaos. He arranged their equipment in precise categories: communications, illumination, food, medical, documentation. The familiar routine provided structure. At 2014, Jessica's radio crackled with an update from dispatch. Emily Russo's emergency contact, her sister Michelle in Portland, had provided additional information. Emily had been acting strangely in the weeks before her trip, talking about researching their family genealogy. She'd discovered that their great-great-grandmother had emigrated from Germany in 1879, settling briefly in Washington Territory before moving to California. Emily had become increasingly obsessed with finding the original settlement location. Nathan felt something cold materialize in his chest. What was the great-great-grandmother's name? Jessica relayed the question. The response came back 30 seconds later. Anna Russo, maiden name Kessler, emigrated from Baden-Württemberg. Nathan opened his field notebook to a page of documentation from his first survey of the Homestead Cemetery. He'd attempted to transcribe the legible names from the grave markers. Third row, eastern side where the recent disturbance had occurred. The marker had been mostly illegible, but he'd managed to capture one partial name through careful angling in specific light. Essler, 1881. Jessica, he said carefully. Emily wasn't looking for historical sites. She was looking for family. They sat in silence as the implications assembled themselves. The forest around them had achieved that particular density of darkness possible only in old-growth ecosystems, where artificial light penetrated only inches before being absorbed by the sheer mass of vegetation. Nathan's flashlight created a sphere of visibility approximately 6 feet in diameter. Beyond that, nothing. At 22:47, they heard the sound. Footsteps, heavy, irregular rhythm, moving through the forest from the east, from the direction the tracks had led. Nathan and Jessica froze, hands moving simultaneously to their flashlights. The beam caught nothing but trees and moss, but the sound continued. Step drag, step drag, step drag. Something was walking toward them through the absolute darkness, and it was walking wrong. Nathan's training insisted on rational assessment. Large mammal, possibly injured. Elk, deer, even bear. All could produce heavy footfalls in certain circumstances, but the rhythm was too regular, too deliberate. This was bipedal locomotion, or something approximating it. The sound stopped approximately 30 feet from their position. In the silence that followed, Nathan became aware of his own breathing, too loud in the humid air. Jessica had her radio ready but didn't key it. What would she report? That they'd heard something walking? The protocols didn't cover this particular category of experience. Then, from the darkness, Nathan Cross, his name, spoken in a voice that sounded like Emily Russo but wrong, the consonants slightly off, the pitch modulated strangely, like someone speaking through damaged vocal cords, like someone whose mouth wasn't quite the right shape anymore. "Emily?" Jessica called out, her voice controlled despite the obvious tension. "Emily Russo? This is Park Ranger Jessica Park. Are you injured? Do you need assistance?" No response. The silence extended 5 seconds, 10, 15. Then the footsteps resumed, but now they were moving away, heading back toward the eastern forest. Step drag, step drag, step drag. They didn't sleep that night. Nathan documented everything in his field notebook, recording timestamps, sound characteristics, weather conditions, temperature readings, facts, data. Reality could be measured and recorded. At 03:22, he pulled out his personal laptop and activated his portable satellite internet connection. The signal was weak but functional. He needed to research something that had been troubling him since finding that symbol on the grave markers. He started with German cemetery customs in the 19th century, then narrowed to Baden-Württemberg region folklore. The search led him through academic databases and historical society archives. At 04:17, He found it. The symbol on the grave markers wasn't decorative. It was apotropaic, specifically a charm against a creature from Germanic folklore called a devourer. The name translated roughly as after devourer or after consumer. According to documented beliefs from the Baden-Württemberg region, a devourer was created when someone died during an epidemic and was buried improperly or with their burial shroud wrapped incorrectly. The corpse would consume its own shroud and flesh in the grave, then begin to psychically drain the life force from its living relatives, drawing them toward death. As relatives died and were buried, they too would become devourer if proper precautions weren't taken. The preventative measures were specific: stake through the heart, decapitation, placement of a coin in the mouth, removal of the heart, or burning. The symbol carved on the markers represented a Totenbaum, a death tree meant to prevent the deceased from rising. Nathan stared at his laptop screen as dawn began its slow infiltration of the rainforest. The rational part of his mind immediately cataloged this as folklore, superstition, cultural artifact. But another part, the part that maintained rigorous documentation precisely because reality needed to be verified, noted several correlations. Anna Kessler died 1881 during what records described as a fever outbreak, buried in what was evidently great haste, given the abrupt abandonment of the settlement shortly after. 7 deaths in 3 weeks, all possibly related, and now, 128 years later, her great-great-granddaughter had come looking for her grave. Nathan. Jessica's voice pulled him from his research. She was standing at the edge of their camp perimeter, looking at something on the ground. "You need to see this." He crossed to her position and found fresh tracks in the moss, human-shaped but elongated, as if the foot had been stretched. The tracks formed a complete circle around their campsite, perhaps 20 feet in diameter. Whatever had called his name had been walking around them, all night. While they sat in their sphere of light, something had been circling in the darkness, close enough to reach them in 2 steps. SAR team arrived at 7:30, 8 personnel with tracking dogs, medical equipment, and communications gear. Nathan briefed them on Emily's last known trajectory and the eastern track trail they'd documented. The dogs picked up a scent immediately, but their behavior troubled the handlers. The animals moved forward reluctantly, whining constantly, pulling toward the trail but simultaneously trying to retreat. Nathan joined the primary search group while Jessica remained at base camp to coordinate. They moved east through increasingly dense forest, following the drag-marked tracks. At 09:14 they found Emily's hiking boots, both of them placed carefully side by side on top of a moss-covered log. Laces still tied. They appeared to have been removed deliberately, not torn off. The tracks beyond this point were barefoot, toes splayed wide, digging deep into the soft earth. The drag mark between them had become more pronounced. At 10:47 they found the second shrine. This one had been constructed more recently, possibly within the past 24 hours. Arranged on a flat stone, Emily's digital camera, her car keys, her driver's license, and her cell phone. The phone was set to display a single photograph, a close-up of one of the grave markers, showing the Totenbaum symbol in detail. The image had been marked up with arrows and annotations in what appeared to be Emily's handwriting, though Nathan couldn't read them without handling evidence. Beyond the shrine, the trail split. The barefoot tracks continued east, but a second set of tracks now appeared, heading north. These were Emily's boot prints, except Emily's boots were sitting on the log half a mile behind them. The SAR team leader made the decision to split the group. 4 personnel would follow the barefoot tracks, 4 would follow the boot prints. Nathan joined the barefoot group, unable to articulate why, but certain it was the correct choice. The part of his mind that dealt in data and documentation had begun to malfunction. Information wasn't assembling into coherent patterns, or rather it was assembling into patterns he couldn't accept. They tracked the barefoot prints for another hour. The forest here had changed character, becoming older, darker, the ground musty with decades of undisturbed leaf fall. The trees stood farther apart but grew more massive. Many showed signs of extreme age, 900 years old, predating European contact by centuries. At 11:52 they found the first body. Not Emily Russo, someone much older. The corpse lay partially exposed in a shallow depression, wearing clothes that had rotted to tatters but maintained enough structure to suggest 19th century construction. Male, based on the skeletal structure. The remains were wrong in ways Nathan's scientific training couldn't immediately categorize. The bones looked porous, as if something had been leaching calcium from within. The skull showed unusual wear patterns around the jaw and teeth, the mandible slightly disarticulated, opened too wide. One of the SR personnel, a paramedic named Torres, examined the remains professionally. "This should be mostly skeletal at this age," he said. "But there's preserved tissue. Look at the hands." The corpse's hands retained desiccated flesh, fingers elongated, nails grown thick and yellowed. The right hand clutched something, a scrap of fabric, very old, partially consumed. Burial shroud, Nathan's mind supplied. It had been eating its burial shroud. They found 3 more bodies in the next 90 yards, all in similar states of preservation, all showing the same characteristics: porous bones, disarticulated jaws, preserved tissue on the extremities. They were arranged in a rough line, pointing east, pointing toward something. The barefoot tracks led directly to the 5th body. Emily Russo lay in a natural depression between 2 ancient spruce trees, her body positioned as if sleeping, hands folded across her chest. She wore her hiking clothes, but her feet were bare, covered in cuts and moss stains. Her eyes were closed. For exactly 3 seconds, Nathan thought they'd found her in time, that she was merely unconscious, that emergency medicine and evacuation procedures would restore order to this situation. Then Torres leaned in to check her pulse and jerked back. "She's cold, she's been dead for hours, but look." Emily Russo's mouth hung open slightly. Her lips had retracted, exposing teeth that seemed too long, too sharp. The soft tissue around her jaw looked wrong, as if the bone structure beneath had begun to change. Her hands, folded peacefully across her chest, showed elongated fingers with yellowed nails. Most disturbing, her mouth contained scraps of fabric, partially consumed, the dye patterns still faintly visible on the cloth. She'd been eating her own clothing. Nathan's documentation reflex took over. He photographed Emily's body from multiple angles, noting every detail with mechanical precision. His hands were shaking. He documented that too, clinically noting the involuntary tremor as a stress response requiring management. Torres was calling in their findings when Emily Russo's eyes opened. Not the sluggish flutter of returning consciousness. The eyes simply snapped open, fully dilated, moving immediately to focus on Nathan's face. Her jaw distended with a sound like tearing fabric, opening far too wide. The scream that emerged wasn't human. It was a sustained shriek of rage and hunger that seemed to vibrate in Nathan's chest cavity. Then she was moving, impossibly fast for someone who'd been dead moments before, lunging toward him with those elongated fingers reaching. Nathan fell backward, camera flying from his hands. Torres tried to intercept her, but Emily, or what Emily had become, swatted him aside with strength that sent him tumbling into the undergrowth. The other SAR members converged, trying to restrain her without causing harm, still operating under the assumption that this was a rescue situation. But Emily was too strong, too fast. She broke away from them and ran east, that same step-drag gait they'd heard in the darkness, moving through the forest with terrible purpose. Nathan picked up his camera with trembling hands. The LCD screen had cracked in the fall, but the device still functioned. He had 47 photographs of Emily Russo's body. Proof, documentation, evidence that his eyes had not deceived him, that his sanity remained intact even as his understanding of reality underwent violent revision. They pursued Emily for 3 hours, the trail leading deeper into forest that grew progressively older, darker, more silent. The dog teams had given up, the animals refusing to follow despite the handlers' coaxing. At 1533, they reached the original settlement site, not the homestead Nathan had surveyed, but something much older. Structures built with European methods but predating the 1880s community by decades. Stone foundations for buildings that had rotted away entirely. And at the center, a cemetery, not 12 graves, 47. Emily stood in the middle of the graveyard, motionless, facing a particular marker. Nathan approached cautiously, his rational mind gibbering in the background while his documentation reflex continued operating on automatic. He could see that Emily was crying, actual tears streaming down her face even as her jaw hung open at that impossible angle, even as her fingers curved into claws. The grave marker before her read, Anna Kessler, 1843-1881, Gott hab Erbarmen. God have mercy. Anna's grave had been opened from within. The earth was torn up, displaced from underneath as if something had clawed its way out. The burial shroud lay in tatters among the disturbed soil, and scattered around the grave, leading away into the forest, were more barefoot tracks. Older tracks, weeks old perhaps, the impressions deep with that characteristic drag mark between them. Nathan understood then, with the clarity of despair. Emily hadn't just found her ancestor's grave. She'd found Anna Kessler herself, still walking these woods 128 years after burial, drawn by the approach of living family, psychically consuming her relative's life force according to the specific mechanisms of Nachtzehrer folklore. Emily had been drained, died, and been buried improperly. No coin in the mouth, no preventative measures, because the SAR team had been operating under the assumption of contemporary medical death, not folkloric transformation. Torres approached from behind, radio in hand. Nathan, we need to... Emily moved so fast she seemed to teleport. One moment standing at Anna's grave, the next her hands were around Torres's throat, that distended jaw lowering toward his neck. The other SAR members rushed forward, but Nathan knew with terrible certainty that physical intervention wouldn't work. This was Nachtzehrer, and Nachtzehrer followed specific rules. Rules documented in German folklore for centuries, rules that required specific countermeasures. He ran to Anna's grave and began digging with his hands, throwing aside soil and rotted wood, until his fingers struck something solid. The body was impossibly preserved, skin like leather, eyes sunken but still present. Anna Kessler's mouth hung open, jaw disarticulated, fingers elongated. She wore the remains of a 19th century dress, the burial shroud partially consumed. Nathan pulled his multi-tool from his belt and extended the knife blade, 4 inches. Stainless steel. Completely inadequate for what folklore required, but it was what he had. He drove the blade into Anna's chest, aiming for where the heart should be, pushing down with both hands until he felt the blade grate against spine. Emily Russo's scream echoed through the forest, not from her throat but from all around them, from the trees themselves, from the earth. She released Torres and turned toward Nathan, covering the distance between them in 3 impossible strides, but something had changed. Her movements had lost their terrible fluidity. She moved jerkily now, fighting against invisible restraints. Nathan twisted the knife, leveraging it deeper. Anna's corpse convulsed beneath his hands. Emily shrieked again and fell to her knees, hands clutching at her own chest. The other bodies, the 4 they'd found earlier, began emerging from the forest, drawn by some shared distress. They moved with that characteristic step-drag gait, converging on the cemetery from multiple directions. "Nathan!" Torres's voice, raw but functional. "Whatever you're doing, do it faster." Nathan withdrew the knife and began sawing at Anna's neck. The desiccated tissue offered surprising resistance, but the folklore was specific. Stake through heart, then decapitation. He needed to complete the sequence. The blade cut through leather-like skin, through preserved muscle, through vertebrae made porous by years of supernatural consumption. When Anna Kessler's head finally separated from her body, Emily Russo collapsed completely. The other Nachtzehrer stopped their advance, standing motionless at the cemetery's edge. Nathan counted them, 7 figures, matching the death toll from the 1881 fever outbreak, the original settlers who died during the epidemic and been buried incorrectly, transforming one by one as the living fled in terror, unable to comprehend what their folklore had tried to warn them about. Emily lay in the moss, breathing shallowly, her jaw slowly returning to normal alignment. The elongation in her fingers began receding, but Nathan knew, from his research from the patterns in the folklore, that the transformation wasn't complete. Emily had died. Emily had fed. Emily had become Nachtzehrer, and while destroying her progenitor had broken the immediate compulsion, the condition itself remained. The other 6 Nachtzehrer watched from the trees, waiting, patient. They'd waited 128 years. They could wait longer. The SR team evacuated Emily on a stretcher, noting her confusion, hypothermia, and signs of psychological trauma. Torres had defensive wounds on his neck, but nothing life-threatening. The official report would document severe weather exposure, psychological break, possible wildlife attack. The cemetery would be noted as a significant historical find requiring proper archaeological survey. Nathan remained behind after the others left, standing in the ruins of the 1881 settlement as dusk gathered. He knew what he had to do. The folklore was specific. 7 graves needed 7 countermeasures. He had 1 multi-tool knife, 1 cigarette lighter, and the knowledge that his professional career was about to end in a way no rational person could ever explain. He started with the first Nachtzehrer, the one that approached most willingly, as if relieved. It took him 4 hours to complete the proper sequence on all 7 bodies. Stake to the heart, decapitation, burning what remained. The creatures didn't fight him. They stood passive as he worked, as if grateful for release from their 128-year hunger. When it was finished, Nathan collapsed beside the smoldering remains of Anna Kessler and cried for the first time since childhood. Not from fear, not from horror, but from the sudden, terrible understanding that documentation wasn't enough, that data couldn't contain reality, that the universe was vastly more complex and more terrible than his years of methodical observation had prepared him for. He burned his field notebooks that night. All of them. 7 years of meticulous documentation reduced to ash and scattered in the Hoh River. Some knowledge wasn't meant to be preserved. Some patterns shouldn't be recorded. Emily Russo was released from Olympic Medical Center 4 days later, with diagnoses of severe dehydration, exposure, and dissociative fugue state. She returned to Sacramento and never hiked again. Nathan requested transfer to a desk position in Aberdeen, processing permits and managing supply logistics. He stopped carrying his camera. He stopped taking notes. He stopped trying to measure and document the world, because measurement implied understanding and understanding implied control, and Nathan Cross no longer believed he controlled anything at all. On November 15th, he received a letter from Michelle Russo, Emily's sister, thanking him for finding Emily alive. The letter included a photograph. Emily standing in her apartment smiling, looking healthy and recovered. But if you looked closely at her hands in the photograph, if you studied the image with the careful attention Nathan had once brought to every observation, you could see that her fingernails were slightly yellowed, slightly thickened. Her smile showed teeth that seemed fractionally too long. The Nachtzehrer condition, according to folklore, was permanent once established. It could be suppressed but never truly cured. Emily would need to be watched. Her relatives would need to be warned. But who would believe him? What documentation could he provide? The evidence had been burned. The bodies reduced to ash. The only proof was his own shattered certainty, and that proved nothing at all. Nathan kept Michelle's letter in his desk drawer. Sometimes, late at night, he would take it out and study Emily's photograph, looking for progression in the transformation, calculating timelines, estimating risks. Old habits died hard. Documentation reflex remained even when documentation itself had been abandoned. 3 weeks after the incident, a family reported their daughter missing in Olympic National Park. Last known position, approximately 4 miles northeast of the Hoh River Trail, near an abandoned settlement. The girl's name was Michelle Russo, 28, visiting from Portland. She'd been researching her family genealogy. She'd wanted to see where her great-great-great-grandmother had been buried. Nathan heard the report on his office radio and said nothing. He filed paperwork. He processed permits. He managed supply logistics. He did not volunteer for the search and rescue operation. Some trails shouldn't be followed. Some family connections needed to stay broken. That night, for the first time in his adult life, Nathan Cross prayed. Not to any god he believed in, but to the vast, indifferent universe that had revealed itself to be so much stranger than data could capture. He prayed that the search team would find Michelle Russo quickly. He prayed they would understand what they were dealing with before someone else died. He prayed that he was wrong about everything he'd learned. But the universe didn't answer. The forest kept its secrets, and somewhere in the ancient darkness of the Hoh rainforest, something moved with a familiar step-drag rhythm, following the scent of family blood, patient and hungry and eternal. Nathan Cross documented nothing at all. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Marcus Bennett had been a ranger in Superior National Forest for 8 years, and he understood the wilderness through equations. Temperature drops of 3 degrees per 1,000 feet of elevation. 7 miles per day was sustainable hiking speed with a 40-pound pack. A healthy adult could survive 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, 3 minutes without air. The Boundary Waters wilderness sprawled across 1,090,000 acres of glacially carved lakes and boreal forest along the Minnesota-Ontario border, and Marcus knew every navigable route through its labyrinth of waterways. Numbers made sense. Numbers were predictable. Numbers didn't lie. Sarah Whitman had been missing for 41 hours. Marcus adjusted the Garmin GPS unit clipped to his parka, watching the coordinates flicker in the pre-dawn darkness. -12 degrees Fahrenheit. The device's backlight cast pale blue across his unshaven face as he stood outside the ranger station at the Moose Lake entry point. Behind him, the station's windows glowed with the harsh fluorescent light of an emergency coordination center. Inside, 2 county sheriffs hunched over topographic maps while the park superintendent argued with someone on a satellite phone. They'd called in a helicopter from Duluth, but the bird wouldn't fly until the winds dropped below 30 knots. Weather Service predicted another 6 hours minimum. Sarah's last radio check had come at 14:37 on January 3rd. She'd been conducting a winter patrol along the Kekikabik Trail, documenting illegal campsites and checking for signs of poaching. Her voice on the recording was calm, professional, mentioning she'd found something unusual near the portage between Amakose and Wissini Lakes. She'd requested permission to investigate. District Supervisor Chen had approved. Then nothing. Marcus had listened to that final transmission 11 times. Each replay brought the same details. Sarah's breathing was slightly elevated, suggesting she'd been hiking uphill. Background noise indicated wind through spruce trees at approximately 15 miles per hour. She'd paused before saying unusual, a hesitation lasting 0.8 seconds. That pause bothered him more than anything else. Sarah didn't hesitate. She was 28, had 3 years in the park, and possessed the kind of practical competence that came from growing up in northern Wisconsin. She could navigate by stars, start fires in wet conditions, and remained methodical under pressure. She didn't get rattled by animal tracks or strange campfires. So what had made her hesitate? Marcus exhaled, watching his breath crystallize instantly in the sub-zero air. The parking area held 4 vehicles, 2 sheriff's cruisers, the superintendent's Suburban, and Marcus's own Ford Ranger. Beyond the plowed area, snowmobile tracks crisscrossed into the wilderness. The search and rescue team from Ely had already deployed along Sarah's known route, working from her last confirmed position backward toward the Moose Lake entry point. Standard protocol. Marcus had reviewed the search grid 3 times, identifying optimal coverage patterns based on terrain difficulty and available daylight hours. But something felt wrong with the math. The first anomaly sat in a manila folder on the station's conference table. Marcus had pulled historical patrol records going back 15 years, cross-referencing incident reports with seasonal patterns. What he'd found made no statistical sense. Since 1994, 7 people had vanished in this specific quadrant of the Boundary Waters during winter months. Not lost and found, vanished. 4 were experienced outdoorsmen, 2 were rangers. The incidents occurred roughly every 26 months, always between December and February, always in the triangle of wilderness bounded by Amakose Lake, Wissini Lake, and the Canadian border. The disappearances showed no obvious connection. Different years, different circumstances, different entry points. But when Marcus plotted them on a map, they formed a pattern. Each incident occurred progressively deeper into the wilderness, moving northwest along a corridor approximately 12 miles long and 3 miles wide. The progression was so precise it looked deliberate, calculated. The most recent disappearance before Sarah had been in January 2007. A solo winter camper named David Aurelius, age 43, experienced backcountry skier. His tent was found intact near the Kekikabik Trail, equipment undisturbed, sleeping bag still warm. No tracks led away from the site. The investigation concluded he'd suffered some kind of mental break and wandered off, likely succumbing to hypothermia within hours. Except David Aurelius had done 3 tours in Afghanistan and held a PhD in environmental psychology. He wasn't the type to panic. Marcus's radio crackled. "Bennett, you copy?" He thumbed the transmit button on his Motorola. "Copy, Chen. Sayar just found Sarah's snowmobile, 3 miles up the Kekikabik, coordinates north 48.074, west 91.342. Machines intact, key still in the ignition." Marcus pulled out his map, marking the position. The location made his stomach tighten. It was exactly where the pattern predicted the next incident would occur. "Any sign of her?" "Negative, but Bennett." Chen's voice carried an edge Marcus had never heard from the normally unflappable supervisor. "They found something else. Tracks." "What kind of tracks?" "Just get up there. Helicopter's leaving in 10 minutes. We got a break in the wind. They'll drop you at the site." The helicopter was a Bell 206 operated by a civilian contractor, the same company that ran aerial firefighting operations in the summer. The pilot was a Vietnam veteran named Kowalski, who flew with the kind of casual competence that suggested nothing could surprise him anymore. Marcus strapped into the back, his emergency pack wedged between his boots. Through the plexiglass canopy, the wilderness rolled away in every direction. A monochrome landscape of snow-covered lakes and dense conifer forest, broken only by occasional granite outcroppings. They flew northwest, following the Kekikabik Trail's general trajectory. Below, Marcus could see the thin line of the path cutting through the forest, marked by the occasional orange diamond nailed to trees. The trail was a historical route, originally used by Ojibwe fur traders, later adopted by voyageurs, now maintained as a primitive hiking corridor. 40 miles of undeveloped wilderness linking the Gunflint Trail to the west with Ely to the southeast. In winter, it was one of the most isolated places in the lower 48 states. "Sights coming up," Kowalski said through the headset. "Looks like your people already set up a perimeter." The helicopter descended toward a small clearing near the frozen lake. Marcus could see the search and rescue team's snowmobiles parked in a rough semicircle, 4 orange-suited figures moving through the trees. Sarah's machine sat apart from the others, a solitary blue Polaris with the Park Service emblem on the cowling. As they dropped below the tree line, Marcus caught sight of what had brought him here. The tracks. They circled Sarah's snowmobile in a wide ring, clearly visible in the fresh snow. But these weren't animal prints in any standard sense. Each track was roughly 3 feet long, showing something like a foot but elongated, skeletal, with toes that extended into claw marks. The stride length suggested something walking upright, but the gait was wrong, too wide, as if whatever made the tracks had joints that bent in unexpected directions. The prints were deep, suggesting significant weight, but they showed no sign of the dragging or sliding Marcus would expect from something moving through knee-deep snow, and there were dozens of them. The helicopter touched down 200 yards from the site. Marcus climbed out, ducking under the rotors as they continued to spin. The cold hit him like a physical force, well below zero even with the sun climbing toward the tree line. He pulled his balaclava over his face and trudged toward the perimeter. Chris Martinez, the SAR team leader, met him halfway. Martinez had 15 years of wilderness rescue experience and ran summer climbing courses in the Rockies during the off-season. His expression was carefully neutral, but Marcus could see tension in the way he held his shoulders. "Bennett, glad you're here." "Show me." They walked to Sarah's snowmobile. Up close, the tracks looked even more disturbing. Marcus crouched beside one, pulling a digital camera from his pack. The print showed 5 distinct toes, but they were too long, too thin, ending in what looked like claws that had cut into the frozen crust beneath the powder. The heel was narrow, barely making contact with the ground. Most unsettling was the depth. The track pressed down nearly 8 inches, but the surrounding snow showed no sign of displacement, as if whatever made it had simply appeared at each footfall without disturbing the surface tension of the snowpack. "Bear?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "No bear moves like that. Wrong stride, wrong foot structure. And look at the pattern." Martinez gestured to the ring of tracks. "They circle the machine maybe 20-30 times, then head northwest into the bush. Doesn't make sense. Animal would approach, investigate, leave. This thing walked circles around her sled for I don't know how long." Marcus stood, following the tracks with his eyes. They moved away from the clearing in a single line, perfectly straight, disappearing into the dense spruce forest. No wandering, no pausing to investigate scents or sounds. Whatever made these prints had known exactly where it was going. "What about Sarah's tracks?" Martinez pointed to a confused area of disturbed snow near the snowmobile's front end. "She dismounted here. You can see her boot prints, size 7, consistent with her equipment manifest. She walked maybe 20 feet toward the tree line, then..." He trailed off. "Then what?" "Then nothing. Her tracks just stop. No sign of a struggle, no drag marks, no blood. She's there, then she's not." Marcus examined the area Martinez indicated. The final boot print was clear and complete, showing the distinctive tread pattern of Sarah's sorrel winter boots. The snow beyond was undisturbed, unmarked by any human presence. But the strange tracks continued past, overlaying where Sarah's prints ended, as if whatever made them had stepped directly onto the spot where she'd been standing. "The other prints," Marcus said slowly. "The circling ones around the snowmobile. When were those made?" Martinez checked his notebook. "Hard to say exactly, but based on snow accumulation and the condition of the crusting, I'd estimate 6 to 8 hours ago, maybe 23 last night." Marcus checked his watch. It was now 09:15. Sarah had been gone for 46 hours. But she disappeared during daylight. Her last radio call was 14:37. "Yeah." Martinez looked uncomfortable. "So either something came back to her snowmobile last night, or the timeline doesn't work." Marcus stood, brushing snow from his gloves. The mathematics of the situation were breaking down, variables refusing to resolve into coherent equations. He pulled out his radio. "Chen, you copy?" "Go ahead, Bennett." "I need everything we have on the 2007 disappearance. David Aurelius. Specifically, I need to know if there were any unusual tracks at his campsite." Static filled the silence for several seconds. "Why?" "Just checking a pattern." More static. Then, "Hold on." Marcus waited, watching the SEAR team systematically photograph and measure the tracks. The sun had fully cleared the trees now, but it provided no warmth, just a harsh white light that made the snow glare painfully. The forest around them was absolutely silent. No birds, no small animals rustling through underbrush, just wind moving through the spruce branches with a sound like distant breathing. The radio crackled. "Bennett, I've got the file. Aurelius campsite. Yeah, there's a note about tracks. Investigating officer described them as unusual. Possibly bare, possibly deformed. Photos weren't conclusive." "Where was his camp?" "Coordinates north 48.087, west 91.356. Marcus pulled out his map, hands already knowing what he'd find. The location was approximately 2 miles northwest of Sarah's snowmobile. Further along the same trajectory, he marked the position, then traced his finger backward along the pattern, checking the coordinates from the other disappearances. They formed a nearly perfect straight line, pointing like an arrow deeper into the wilderness, toward the most isolated section of the boundary waters, toward an area marked on the topographic map as Wendigo Lake. The name hit him like a fist. Wendigo, Weedico. He'd seen the word before in fragments of research he'd done years ago about regional place names, an Algonquian term, related to indigenous legends from the northern forests. Something about hunger, about winter, about things that moved through the wilderness and left people changed or vanished. He pulled out his smartphone, but the device showed no signal. The Boundary Waters had spotty coverage even in summer. In winter, with the cold affecting battery performance, it was useless. He'd need to wait until he was back at the station to do proper research. But the name resonated in his mind, triggering associations he couldn't quite grasp. Marcus. Martinez was standing beside him, speaking quietly. "What do you want to do?" Marcus looked at the tracks leading into the forest. By every protocol, by every regulation, they should wait for additional resources. The helicopter, more SAR personnel, maybe even the state police. But Sarah had been missing for 46 hours. At these temperatures, survival time was measured in exposures. Each hour decreased the probability of recovery by a calculable percentage, and the math kept getting worse. "I'm going after them," Marcus said. "That's not procedure." "Procedure says we follow all viable leads. These tracks are viable." Martinez studied him for a long moment. "You know what those are?" "They're tracks. They're not tracks from anything natural, Bennett. I've spent 20 years in wilderness rescue. I've tracked everything from lost kids to fugitive murder suspects. Those prints aren't anything I've ever seen." He paused. "Neither have you." Marcus shouldered his pack. "Someone made them. That makes them worth following." He started into the forest before Martinez could argue further. Behind him, he heard the SAR leader speaking into his radio, reporting the decision to Chen. There would be paperwork later, probably a formal review. Marcus didn't care. The numbers had stopped making sense, which meant the problem had moved beyond standard analysis. He needed more data. The tracks led northwest through dense spruce forest, the prints unnervingly consistent. No variation in stride length, no deviation in direction. Whatever made these had moved with mechanical precision through terrain that would challenge even experienced hikers. Marcus followed at a steady pace, marking his route with orange survey tape every 50 yards. The forest changed around him, gradually at first, then more noticeably. The spruce trees grew more twisted, their branches contorted into shapes that seemed deliberately wrong. Moss hung from the limbs in thick streamers, unusual for winter, as if the normal seasonal cycles didn't apply here. The snow became harder to traverse, developing a crust that broke under his boots with sounds like snapping bones. After 30 minutes, Marcus stopped to check his GPS. The device's screen flickered erratically, showing his position jumping between coordinates separated by hundreds of yards. He tapped the unit, but the readings refused to stabilize. Equipment malfunction, possibly cold-related, though his spare batteries were fresh and the device was rated for temperatures far below what he was experiencing. He switched to compass navigation, but the needle spun lazily without settling on any particular bearing. Magnetic anomaly, probably iron ore deposits in the bedrock, though the geological surveys didn't indicate any significant mineralization in this area. He marked his current position on the paper map, relying on dead reckoning. The tracks continued their straight line. Marcus followed. An hour passed, then two. The forest grew darker despite the daylight, the canopy overhead thickening until only scattered shafts of illumination penetrated the gloom. Marcus's breath came in harsh gasps, the cold air burning his lungs. His internal calculations told him he should have covered approximately 4 miles, but the terrain made that estimate uncertain. The tracks never wavered, never paused, never showed the slightest hesitation. He rounded a massive white pine and stopped. A structure stood in a clearing ahead, not a natural formation. Someone had built a shelter here, a crude A-frame assembled from deadfall timber and branches. Old, at least several winters old, judging by the weathering on the exposed wood, but maintained. Fresh boughs covered sections of the roof, and the snow around the structure had been disturbed recently. The tracks led directly to the shelter's entrance, then stopped. Marcus approached slowly, his breath loud in the silence. The clearing felt wrong in ways his rational mind couldn't articulate. The snow was darker here, stained with something that created irregular brown patches around the shelter. The smell was worse, a thick organic reek that suggested decomposition accelerated beyond what the freezing temperatures should allow. He pulled a flashlight from his pack and directed the beam through the shelter's opening. Bodies, or what remained of them. 3 shapes lay inside, twisted into positions that suggested they'd died in extreme agony. The cold had preserved them, but something had been feeding. Large sections of tissue were missing, removed with what looked like bite marks, but far too large, far too savage. The corpses were ancient, mummified by cold and time, but the feeding looked recent, fresh. Marcus's training kicked in, overriding his horror with procedure. He documented the scene with his camera, forcing himself to note details. 2 males, 1 female, all wearing clothing consistent with outdoor recreation from various decades. One body still wore the remnants of what might have been a ranger's uniform, though the fabric was too deteriorated to be certain. The position suggested they hadn't died together, but had been brought here afterward, arranged in a specific pattern, a pattern Marcus recognized. He'd seen something similar in a book about indigenous burial practices years ago. The bodies were positioned to form the shape of something, a symbolic representation. He stepped back, trying to see the larger picture. The positioning was deliberate, careful, showing an intelligence that made his skin crawl. The 3 corpses created the outline of a larger form, arms and legs extended to suggest something much bigger, much more terrible. Something that walked on 2 legs but wasn't human. His radio crackled, startling him violently. "Bennett, you copy?" The signal was weak, breaking up. Marcus keyed his transmitter. "Copy, Chen. Barely reading you." "SAR. Lost. Signal. Return to..." The transmission dissolved into static. Marcus tried to respond, but his radio was dead, the battery indicator showing full charge but the device completely unresponsive. He checked his spare radio. Same result. He was alone. The smart move was to return to the perimeter immediately, report what he'd found, bring back a proper forensic team. Marcus turned to retrace his steps. The tracks he'd followed were gone. Not covered by snow, just gone. The orange survey tape he'd marked still hung from branches every 50 yards, but the footprints he'd been following had vanished completely, as if they'd never existed. The snow between markers was smooth, undisturbed, showing no sign that anything had passed through in either direction. Marcus stood motionless, his heart hammering against his ribs. This violated every principle he understood about the physical world. Tracks didn't disappear. Matter left traces. Everything could be measured, quantified, explained through rational analysis. A sound echoed through the forest. Not quite a voice, but something between a scream and laughter, high-pitched and hungry. It came from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating between the trees until Marcus couldn't determine any point of origin. Then it cut off, leaving silence so absolute he could hear his own blood pulsing in his ears. Something moved in the darkness between the trees. Marcus saw it only in fragments, glimpses that his mind struggled to assemble into a coherent image. Too tall, 8 feet at least. Impossibly thin, skeletal, with limbs that bent at wrong angles. Its movement was fluid but jerky, like stop-motion animation, appearing at one spot then another without seeming to cross the distance between. Where it passed, the snow developed that same dark staining he'd seen around the shelter. It was circling him. Marcus's training provided options. Make noise, appear large, back away slowly. Standard protocols for predator encounters. But this wasn't a bear or wolf. This was something else entirely. And every instinct screaming through his rational mind told him that standard protocols would be meaningless. He ran. The forest became a blur of white and black, branches tearing at his parka, roots hidden under snow trying to trip him. Marcus focused on maintaining speed, on keeping his breathing controlled, on not thinking about what was behind him. The orange survey tape flashed past, each marker a small victory, proof that he was covering ground, getting closer to the perimeter. The thing was faster. It appeared ahead of him, materializing between 2 trees. Marcus veered left, changing direction without slowing. The creature didn't pursue in a straight line. It flanked him, always staying at the edge of his peripheral vision, never quite in full view, playing with him. The realization was worse than the chase itself. It could catch him whenever it wanted. It was choosing not to. Marcus broke through the tree line into a clearing he didn't recognize. A frozen lake stretched before him, maybe a quarter-mile across. The ice looked thick, safe for crossing. But he'd been moving northwest, and there should be no lake in this direction according to his maps. He'd gotten turned around somehow, disoriented during the chase. The thing stood at the tree line behind him, finally visible in full. Marcus's mind tried to reject what he was seeing. The creature was impossibly emaciated, ribs showing through grayish skin that looked more like bark than flesh. Its face was elongated, almost lupine, but with two human eyes that gleamed with an intelligence that was terrifying in its clarity. Antlers sprouted from its skull, massive and complicated, dripping with something that steamed in the cold air. Its mouth was a ruin of broken teeth and exposed jawbone, and when it opened to make that terrible sound again, Marcus saw the remains of something recent wedged in the back of its throat. A piece of blue fabric. Standard Park Service issue, Sarah's uniform. The creature stepped onto the ice. Marcus ran. He made it perhaps 200 yards before the ice began to crack. The sound was unmistakable, a deep groaning that rose from beneath his feet. Marcus changed direction, trying to reach the far shore, but the crack spread faster than he could move. The ice buckled, and suddenly he was in the water. The shock of cold so intense it drove every thought from his mind except the immediate, desperate need to breathe. He surfaced, gasping, his limbs already going numb. The edge of the ice was 5 feet away. Might as well have been 5 miles. His pack was dragging him down, the weight impossible to shed with fingers that no longer responded to commands. The water was impossibly cold, below freezing somehow, staying liquid through some mechanism his rational mind couldn't process even as it killed him. The creature stood on solid ice 20 feet away, watching. Not hunting now, just observing. Waiting. Marcus tried to swim, but his muscles refused. Tried to call out, but his jaw was locked shut. Tried to understand what was happening, but his thoughts were fragmenting. Neurons shutting down as his core temperature dropped past the point of recovery. Numbers filled his consciousness. 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. But no equations for this, no variables to calculate survival probability when the wilderness itself had become hostile, when the natural laws he'd built his worldview upon had stopped applying. Something grabbed his collar. He was dragged onto the ice, coughing water, his body convulsing with shivers so violent they might crack bones. Through the haze of hypothermia, Marcus saw the shape above him. Not the creature. A person. Human. Small, female, wearing a tattered Park Service parka. Sarah. She looked wrong. Her face was too pale, lips blue-black with frostbite. Her eyes were distant, focused on something beyond the immediate physical world. But she was moving, functioning, pulling him away from the broken ice with strength that seemed impossible for her frame. "Don't look at it," she whispered. Her voice was rough, damaged. "Don't meet its eyes. That's how it finds you." Marcus tried to respond, but his teeth were chattering too hard for speech. Sarah dragged him into the tree line, into a small depression where the snow had drifted deep. She pulled off her own outer layer and wrapped it around him, then began the process of treating hypothermia with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this before. What? Marcus managed. "The Wendigo," Sarah said quietly. "I read about them when I first got posted here. Thought they were just stories. Algonquian legends. Spirits of winter hunger. Things that were once human but ate flesh during famine and became something else. I thought I was being culturally respectful by learning the local mythology." She laughed, a sound without humor. "I didn't believe it was real until it took me. The T-tracks. It doesn't leave tracks. Not really. Those prints are what people expect to see. What their minds create to explain what can't be explained. The Wendigo moves between moments, between the spaces in perception. You don't see it approach, it's just suddenly there, and by then it's too late. She pulled his soaked gloves off, examining his fingers. You'll probably lose some tissue to frostbite, but you'll live, unless we're still here when night comes. We need to get out. Radio for extraction. Radio doesn't work here. None of the equipment does. We're in its territory now, the place where winter is always hungry, where the old rules apply. Sarah looked toward the lake, her expression haunted. It's been feeding on people for decades, maybe centuries. The Park Service knows, I think. They have to. All those disappearances in the same area, the same pattern. They know, but what can they do? How do you warn people about something that shouldn't exist? Marcus's shivers were beginning to subside, his core temperature slowly stabilizing. His rational mind tried to process what Sarah was saying, tried to fit it into a framework that made sense. But the framework was broken. He'd seen the creature, seen tracks appear and disappear, seen ice break under him in water that shouldn't be liquid. The math didn't work because the equations were wrong. The universe operated on principles he'd never learned. The people in the shelter, he said. The bodies. Offerings. Or warnings. I'm not sure which. The Wendigo keeps them there, preserved, arranged in that pattern. I think it's showing us what we'll become. What we are in its eyes. Sarah pulled a space blanket from her pack, wrapping it around Marcus. I've been hiding for 2 days. It finds me at night, chases me but doesn't kill me. Not yet. I think it's playing. Or maybe it's waiting for something. For me to weaken enough. To get hungry enough. Hungry? That's what the legends say. The Wendigo was human once. Someone who ate another person's flesh to survive winter. The act transformed them, made them into something that can never be satisfied. They're always starving, always hunting, always feeding, but never full. And the hunger spreads. If you eat, if you consume what it offers. She trailed off, looking at her hands. I've been so hungry, Marcus. 2 days without food in this cold. The Wendigo keeps leaving things. Pieces of meat. I know what they are, but part of me doesn't care anymore. That's how it works. It waits until you're desperate enough to cross the line. Then you become like it. Marcus forced himself to sit up despite the pain, despite the way his muscles screamed in protest. We're getting out of here, both of us. How? Which direction is out? The forest changes. The paths don't stay where they're supposed to be. I've tried to leave. I've followed every trail I could find. They all loop back here to the lake, to its territory. The sun. We use the sun for navigation. Basic survival technique. Northeast gets us back to the Keikikabik Trail. Then we follow it south to the perimeter. Sarah looked at him with something like pity. You still think this is a normal wilderness. You still believe in compasses and GPS and straight lines. This isn't that kind of place, Marcus. This is where the old stories are true. Where winter has teeth. Where hunger wears skin like a costume and whispers in voices you recognize. The temperature was dropping. Marcus could feel it. A change that went beyond the normal chill of a Minnesota January. This was something deeper. A cold that emanated from the forest itself. From the ice on the lake. From the spaces between the trees where the Wendigo waited. His chronograph showed 1547. Which meant they had maybe 2 hours before full darkness. 2 hours to find a path that might not exist, to escape something that defied every natural law he understood. We move anyway, Marcus said. Standing still guarantees we die. They moved northeast, Marcus using the sun's position despite Sarah's protests. The forest resisted them. Deadfalls appeared where none should exist. Ravines opened up that weren't on his topographic maps. The snow deepened until they were wading through drifts that came to their waists. But they kept moving, kept pushing through the wilderness that seemed determined to hold them. After an hour, they found the trail. Not the Keikikabik Trail. Something older, a path worn through the forest floor where the snow didn't accumulate, where the trees grew back from the edges as if afraid to encroach. Stone markers stood at intervals, carved with symbols Marcus didn't recognize, but that made his eyes hurt to look at directly. Algonquian petroglyphs, maybe, or something older. This isn't on any map, Sarah said. "Neither are we." Marcus started down the trail. It led southeast, roughly the direction they needed. The alternative was to continue fighting through the forest as darkness approached. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. They walked for what felt like hours, but might have been minutes. Time had become elastic, unreliable. Marcus's chronograph showed impossible readings, jumping forward then backward, the second hand sometimes moving counterclockwise. The trail curved around the northern shore of the frozen lake, then descended into a valley where the trees grew so thick that even midday light couldn't penetrate. The markers became more frequent, the symbols more elaborate, and between them, hanging from branches, were objects. Carved wooden figures, bundles of herbs, small animal bones arranged in specific patterns. Offerings, Marcus realized. People had been here before, had walked this path, had tried to appease whatever lived in these woods. "Marcus." Sarah's voice was strained. "I smell food." He smelled it too. Cooking meat, rich and fatty, impossibly appealing given their circumstances. His stomach clenched with sudden hunger, saliva flooding his mouth. They hadn't eaten in hours. The smell was overwhelming, promising warmth and sustenance and relief from the cold that seemed to have settled permanently into his bones. "Don't," Sarah whispered, but her feet were already carrying her toward the source of the smell. Marcus grabbed her arm. "It's the Wendigo. It's trying to lure us." "I know, but I'm so hungry. I can't think about anything else. Just one bite. Just enough to keep going." "If you eat, you become it. That's what you said. Maybe that's better. At least I wouldn't be cold anymore. At least I wouldn't feel this emptiness." Her eyes were wild, desperate. "You don't understand. You've only been here hours. I've been starving for 2 days. The hunger is everywhere, in everything. I can smell meat on the wind. I can taste it when I breathe. I'm starting to look at you and see." She cut herself off, pulling away from him. Marcus saw the horror in her expression, the realization of what she'd almost admitted. The Wendigo didn't just create hunger. It spread it, made it infectious, turned human beings into creatures that would consume anything to fill a void that could never be satisfied. "We keep moving," Marcus said firmly. "We don't eat. We don't stop. We get out of here, and then we get food, and then we never come back." They pressed on, though the smell of cooking meat followed them. So did other sounds, whispers in English and languages Marcus didn't know. Laughter that might have been human once, the crack of breaking ice even though they were hundreds of yards from the lake. And underneath it all, a constant low sound like breathing, as if the forest itself was alive and watching their progress. The trail emerged from the valley at what Marcus's malfunctioning chronograph suggested was 1823. Full darkness was minutes away, but ahead, through the trees, he saw lights. Electric lights, the orange glow of sodium vapor lamps over a parking area. "Is that?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "The ranger station, we made it." They ran, or tried to. Their legs were leaden, exhausted beyond what the distance traveled should have caused. The lights seemed to recede as they approached, always the same distance away like a mirage. Marcus pushed harder, his lungs burning, his frost-damaged fingers throbbing with each heartbeat. And then they were there, breaking through the tree line into the Moose Lake entry point parking area. The station's windows glowed with warm light. 3 vehicles sat in the plowed lot. The helicopter was gone, probably returned to Duluth with the falling darkness. But there were people visible through the windows, moving with the purposeful urgency of an ongoing emergency operation. Marcus and Sarah staggered toward the entrance. The door opened before they reached it. Chen stood framed in the doorway, his expression cycling through shock, relief, and something else Marcus couldn't identify. "Jesus Christ," Chen breathed. "We've been searching for you for 3 days." Marcus stopped. 3 days? You went into the woods at 09:15 on January 4th. It's now 1947 on January 7th. Where the hell have you been? 3 days. Marcus had experienced perhaps 6 hours. Time dilation on a scale that made no sense, that couldn't be explained by disorientation or hypothermia. He looked at Sarah, saw his own confusion reflected in her face. They'd lost 3 days in a wilderness that operated outside normal causality. The medical evaluation took 2 hours. Both Marcus and Sarah showed advanced signs of hypothermia and dehydration, though the severity didn't match the reported timeline. Frostbite on extremities, severe exhaustion, early-stage malnutrition, but nothing that suggested 3 days of exposure. The doctor, brought in from the hospital in Ely, kept asking questions they couldn't answer. Where had they sheltered? What had they eaten? How had they survived multiple nights at temperatures that dropped to -30? Marcus said nothing about the Wendigo, the shelter full of corpses, the impossible tracks, the trail with stone markers that wasn't on any map. He gave a carefully edited version of events, got disoriented, lost equipment, found Sarah, struggled to navigate back, thought it was same day. His tone was flat, professional, the voice of someone reporting facts rather than experiences. Sarah did the same. Their stories matched on key details because they'd silently agreed, in that moment before entering the station, that no one would believe the truth. That reporting what they'd seen would accomplish nothing except ending their careers and possibly getting them committed for psychological evaluation. The forensic team found the shelter 2 days later, guided by the GPS coordinates Marcus reluctantly provided. They recovered 3 bodies, identified through dental records as individuals who disappeared in the boundary waters between 1994 and 2007. Cause of death remained officially undetermined, though tissue analysis showed extensive predation by unknown scavengers. The scene was documented, then quietly closed. The Park Service issued updated safety bulletins about winter travel in the boundary waters. A new emergency cache was established at the Moose Lake entry point. Nothing was said about tracks, or patterns, or creatures that shouldn't exist. Marcus returned to work 6 weeks later. He'd lost 2 toes to frostbite and carried new scars that ached during temperature changes. He requested a transfer to a different district, to forests where the maps matched the terrain and the trails led where they were supposed to lead. The request was denied. The Park Service needed experienced rangers in the boundary waters, especially after the recent incidents. He adapted. He learned to avoid certain areas, to recognize the subtle signs that marked the Wendigo's territory. The twisted trees, the silence where birds should sing, the dark stains in the snow that appeared during the coldest months. He warned other rangers in careful language that sounded like standard safety briefings, but contained coded messages for those who'd listen. Stay on marked trails during winter. Don't investigate unusual tracks. If you smell cooking meat in the wilderness, move immediately in the opposite direction. Never eat anything you find in the woods between December and February. And if you see something that shouldn't exist, something tall and thin that moves between the trees, don't try to rationalize it, just run. Sarah quit the Park Service entirely. Marcus heard she moved to Arizona, to desert landscapes where winter was a mild inconvenience rather than a living predator. They spoke once after her departure, a brief phone call where neither mentioned what had happened. But at the end, before hanging up, Sarah said something that Marcus thought about during every winter patrol afterward. It's still hungry. It's always hungry. And we fed it just by being there, by existing in its territory, by bleeding and sweating and radiating warmth into the cold. That's what it eats, really. Life itself. The heat we generate just by living. And there's never enough. There can never be enough. Marcus understood. The Wendigo wasn't just a creature or a spirit. It was winter's essence given form, the inevitable entropy that ate at the edges of all living things. It was the void inside every survival shelter, the darkness beyond every campfire, the hunger that waited in the spaces between human warmth. And every winter it woke up. Every winter it hunted. Every winter someone new wandered into its territory, following tracks that would disappear, chasing explanations that would never satisfy the rational mind. He saw its work in the statistics. Every 26 months another disappearance. Different circumstances, different entry points, but always the same pattern. The progression northwest, deeper into the wilderness, following a trajectory that pointed toward places where the old names still had power. where the stories remembered what modern maps had forgotten. On February 12, 2011, a solo winter camper named James Morrison vanished near Amacos Lake. His tent was found intact, his equipment undisturbed. The investigation concluded he'd suffered a medical emergency and wandered away from his campsite. The report made no mention of the tracks that circled his tent 23 times before leading northwest into the forest. Marcus read the report and said nothing. He marked the coordinates on his personal map, noting the pattern's continuation. By his calculations, the next incident would occur in December 2013, approximately 3 miles further along the same trajectory, deeper into the Wendigo's territory, closer to whatever lay at the heart of that hungry darkness. He thought about requesting another transfer, about warning people more explicitly, about organizing an expedition to hunt the thing that had nearly killed him. But he knew none of those actions would change anything. The Wendigo was patient. It had been hunting these woods for longer than the Park Service had existed, longer than white settlers had mapped the territory, longer than anyone could document. It was part of the landscape now, woven into the ecology like wolves or bears, a predator that couldn't be removed without understanding the fundamental nature of winter itself. So Marcus did his job. He conducted patrols, filed reports, helped coordinate search operations when someone went missing, and every winter when the temperature dropped below zero and the boundary waters transformed into a maze of frozen lakes and silent forests, he felt it out there, watching, waiting, hungry. The rational part of his mind, the part that still believed in equations and measurable variables, kept trying to find patterns, to develop protocols, to create systems that would prevent future disappearances. But the part of him that had walked the trail with stone markers, that had looked into eyes that reflected no humanity, that part understood the truth. Some things couldn't be calculated. Some variables refused to resolve. Some equations had no solution because the universe operated on principles that predated mathematics, that existed in the spaces where logic broke down and older truths held sway. The Wendigo was one of those things, and it was still out there, circling in the darkness beyond the reach of his flashlight, leaving tracks that would disappear by morning, feeding on the warmth that radiated from every living body that dared enter its frozen domain. Always hungry, never satisfied, eternal as winter itself. Marcus understood that now, and understanding changed nothing. The wilderness kept its secrets, the cold kept its teeth, and every winter something ancient and terrible woke up in the boundary waters, patient and predatory, waiting for the next moment of human weakness, the next opportunity to feed. The numbers no longer mattered, because some appetites couldn't be measured. Some hungers had no equation. And in the deepest winter in the most isolated corners of the northern forest, mathematics gave way to mythology, and reason surrendered to ancient gnawing terror that could never be satisfied.